Hello and welcome to Dreamtime History. Imagine standing at a narrow pass between mountain and sea, watching an army of perhaps 120,000 Persians advance toward you. You're one of roughly 7,000 Greeks holding this bottleneck called the Hot Gates of Thermopylae. Among you stand 300 Spartans, yes, but also Thespians, Thebans, Phocians, ordinary men from small cities who chose to stand. For 3 days, this corridor of dust and stone becomes the fulcrum of empires. The story we remember speaks of 300 heroes facing impossible odds. But what really happened at Thermopylae? Who else stood beside the Spartans? How did geography, betrayal and sacrifice shape those final hours? And why did this tactical defeat become one of history's most enduring legends? Tonight, we will walk that ancient pass and discover the truth beneath the myth. But before we walk that pass, please like the video and subscribe. It means a great deal to me, and I'd love to hear where in the world you're listening tonight. You arrive at the pass in the cool hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath between darkness and light. The air tastes of salt carried inland from the Malian Gulf, mixing with the dry dust of mountain stone and the faint mineral tang of hot springs bubbling somewhere nearby. Behind you, the Kallidromos Mountains rise steep and forbidding, their slopes tangled with scrub oak and thorny brush, their peaks lost in morning haze. Before you, only paces away, the sea slips close against the shore, its gentle waves lapping at rocks worn smooth by millennia of tide and weather. Between mountain and water lies a corridor so narrow that you could walk its width in mere moments, a slender ribbon of passable ground threading through an otherwise impassable landscape. This is Thermopylae. The name means hot gates, drawn from those thermal springs that seep through fissures in the limestone, sending wisps of steam curling into the air even on the warmest days. The springs give the place its name, but it is the geography that gives it meaning. Stand here and turn slowly, taking in the contours of the land. Notice how the mountains press close, how the sea refuses to yield, how the corridor narrows and widens in subtle variations but never truly opens. Notice the bottleneck, the natural choke point where the pass constricts to its tightest width, where perhaps a few dozen men standing shoulder to shoulder could block the path entirely. There is nothing grand about this place at first glance. No soaring monuments, no cities gleaming in sunlight, no harbours filled with ships or roads paved with marble. It is simply a pass, one of many threading through the coastal ranges of central Greece, a place where travellers and merchants and shepherds have walked for generations, moving between the northern plains and the lands to the south. The rocks underfoot are ordinary limestone, weathered and cracked. The vegetation clings, stubbornly to thin soil. The hot springs bubble quietly, unremarked, their warmth pleasant but not remarkable. If you were simply passing through on an ordinary journey, you might hardly notice the place at all. But stand here long enough, and you begin to sense something else. You begin to understand the strategic weight embedded in this modest geography. Consider what it means for a narrow pass to sit astride the only practical coastal route south. Consider what it means for mountains to rise so steeply on one side that no army could easily climb them, for the sea to press so close on the other that no force could simply wade around through the shallows. Consider what it means for the corridor to narrow to a point where numbers cease to matter in the way they usually do, where 10,000 men become no more useful than 1,000, because only so many can stand abreast. Only so many can bring weapons to bear at once. This is a place where scale collapses. This is a place where the normal calculus of warfare bends and warps under the pressure of terrain. A vast army approaching from the north would find its advantage dissolving with each step into the pass. Its cavalry would be useless here, unable to maneuver, unable to charge. Its archers would struggle to find clear lines of sight through the confined space. Its infantry would funnel into the bottleneck, compressed and constrained, unable to deploy in the sweeping formations that win battles on open ground. The pass would swallow their numbers and render them almost irrelevant. You begin to see why this place might matter, why generals and kings and city councils might study maps and trace their fingers along this coastline and pause here, at this unremarkable gap between mountain and sea, why soldiers might be sent to hold this ground, to plant their feet in the dust and refuse passage, why the narrow corridor might become the fulcrum upon which empires balance and futures pivot. The wind shifts slightly, carrying the scent of wild thyme from the mountainside. Somewhere in the distance a gull cries out, its voice echoing off the rocks. The morning light strengthens, painting the eastern peaks in shades of rose and gold. The sea continues its patient work, advancing and retreating against the shore. The hot springs steam quietly in their crevices. The past simply exists, as it has existed for millennia, as it will exist for millennia more, indifferent to the human dramas that will soon unfold across its stones. But you sense those dramas approaching. You sense the weight of the moment gathering like storm clouds beyond the horizon. You know, standing here in this quiet dawn, that this place is about to become something more than a pass, more than a geographic feature marked on travellers' maps. It is about to become a story. It is about to become a name that echoes through history, spoken with reverence and wonder and sorrow. How does a place so modest, so unassuming, become the stage for one of history's most enduring legends? How does this narrow corridor between mountain and sea transform into the site where perhaps 7,000 Greeks will stand against the advancing tide of an empire? What alchemy of geography, timing, human choice and circumstance will make these ordinary stones and this unremarkable coastline into something that people will remember and retell for thousands of years? The past offers no answers yet. It simply waits, patient and silent, for the footsteps that are coming, for the armies that will converge here, for the choices that will be made, for the blood that will be spilled, for the memory that will be forged. The hot gates stand ready, as they always have, to channel history through their narrow throat. To understand why a narrow pass in central Greece would matter to the fate of empires, you must first turn your gaze eastward, across the Aegean Sea, beyond the coast of Asia Minor, deep into the vast territories that stretch toward the rising sun. There, in lands that encompass river valleys and mountain ranges, deserts and fertile plains, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the edges of India lies an empire unlike anything the world has yet seen. This is the Achaemenid Empire, and by the early decades of the 5th century before the Common Era, it has grown into something almost incomprehensible in its scale and complexity. The empire's origins lie generations back, in the highlands of Persia, where tribal chieftains consolidated power and ambition. But it is under Cyrus the Great, in the mid-6th century, that the true expansion begins. Cyrus conquers the Median kingdom, absorbs Lydia in Asia Minor, takes Babylon itself. His successors continue the work, each adding territories, each extending the reach of Persian authority further into the known world. Cambyses brings Egypt under control. Darius, ascending to the throne around 522 before the Common Era, consolidates and organizes this sprawling collection of conquered peoples into something approaching a coherent administrative system. What makes the Achaemenid Empire remarkable is not simply its territorial extent, though that is staggering enough. It is the machinery of governance that Darius constructs to hold such diversity together. He divides the empire into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap who collects tribute, maintains order, and enforces imperial will. A network of roads begins to thread through the empire, most famously the royal road stretching more than 1,600 miles from Sardis in the west to Susa in the heartland, allowing messengers and administrators to move with unprecedented speed across vast distances. A standardized system of weights and measures emerges. Coinage spreads, facilitating trade and tax collection. The empire becomes, in a sense, a vast organism with Persia as its beating heart, sending commands and receiving tribute through arteries of communication and control. The peoples under Persian rule are legion: Medes and Persians, Babylonians and Assyrians, Egyptians and Phoenicians, peoples of the Indus Valley and the steppes beyond, each with their own languages, customs, gods, and ancient traditions. The genius of the Achaemenid system lies partly in its flexibility. Local customs are often respected, local religions tolerated, local elites co-opted into the imperial structure. The Persians rule not through constant military occupation, but through the more subtle mechanisms of tribute, loyalty oaths, and the ever-present knowledge that rebellion will bring the full weight of imperial power crashing down upon the rebellious province. By the time Darius consolidates his rule, the empire's western frontier has reached the Aegean coast. Greek-speaking cities dot the shores of Asia Minor, ancient settlements with their own traditions of independence and self-governance. These Ionian Greeks find themselves absorbed into the Persian system, paying tribute, acknowledging Persian overlordship, their autonomy constrained by the presence of Persian-appointed tyrants and the distant authority of the great king. For many, this arrangement is tolerable, even profitable. Trade flows, wealth accumulates, life continues. But for others, the loss of independence chafes, the memory of self-rule lingers, resentment builds quietly beneath the surface of accommodation. In 499 before the Common Era, that resentment erupts into open revolt. The Ionian cities rise against Persian authority, expelling their tyrants, declaring independence, appealing to their cousins across the Aegean for aid. Athens and Eretria, two cities on the Greek mainland, respond to the call. They send ships and soldiers to support the rebellion. The revolt spreads, gains momentum, achieves early successes. The rebels march inland and burn Sardis, the satrapal capital, a provocative strike deep into Persian territory. But the empire's resources are vast, and its patience long. Slowly, methodically, Persian forces gather and respond. The rebellion is crushed city by city, until by 493 it collapses entirely. The Ionian Greeks return to Persian control, their bid for freedom extinguished. But something has changed. The Athenians and Eretrians who aided the revolt have drawn the attention of the great king. They have interfered in the internal affairs of the empire. They have burned a Persian city. Such provocations cannot go unanswered. Darius begins to prepare. He dispatches a fleet and army westward, across the Aegean, to punish the mainland Greeks who dared to meddle in his empire. In 490, his forces land near Athens at a place called Marathon. But here, unexpectedly, the punitive expedition meets defeat. The Athenian hoplites, heavily armoured infantry fighting in tight formation, rout the Persian force in a stunning victory. The invaders retreat. The threat recedes. Yet the defeat at Marathon does not end Persian ambitions toward Greece. It merely postpones them. Darius dies before he can mount a second expedition, but his son Xerxes inherits both the throne and the unfulfilled intention. Xerxes is young, ambitious, aware of his father's unfinished business. He begins to plan something far more comprehensive than Darius's punitive raid. He envisions not a quick strike but a full-scale invasion, a massive movement of force designed to subjugate the Greek mainland entirely, to bring these troublesome cities into the empire's fold permanently. The preparations take years. Resources flow from across the empire toward the western frontier. Soldiers are levied from every satrapy, ships requisitioned from every coastal province. Supplies are stockpiled, routes scouted, bridges planned. The machinery of the Achaemenid state focuses its considerable energies on a single objective: the conquest of Greece. By 480 before the Common Era, everything is ready. The moment approaches when this eastern colossus will turn its full attention westward, when its armies will cross into Europe, when its shadow will fall across the narrow pass at Thermopylae. Now turn your attention back across the Aegean, away from the unified machinery of empire, toward the fragmented world that awaits the Persian advance. Greece in the early 5th century before the Common Era is not a nation in any sense that we would recognize today. It is not a unified state with a single capital, a central government, a shared military command. It is instead a mosaic of independent city-states, each fiercely proud of its autonomy, each jealously guarding its own laws and customs and traditions. The Greeks call these city-states polis, and they are scattered across the mainland and islands like seeds cast by an indifferent hand, each taking root in its own soil, each growing into its own distinct form. Athens and Sparta are the most famous, the most powerful, but they are merely the largest pieces in a puzzle that contains hundreds of smaller fragments. Corinth and Thebes, Argos and Megara, Elis and Phocis, tiny settlements on remote islands, farming communities in mountain valleys, trading ports along rocky coastlines. Each polis governs itself, makes its own decisions, conducts its own diplomacy, raises its own armies. Each has its own constitution, whether democracy or oligarchy or tyranny or some hybrid form peculiar to local circumstance. Each worships the same gods but in its own way, with its own festivals and rituals and sacred sites. Each speaks Greek but in its own dialect, its own accent, its own local variations of vocabulary and pronunciation. What binds these scattered communities into something approaching a shared identity is subtle and often tenuous. They recognize each other as Hellenes, as distinct from the barbarians who speak unintelligible languages. They gather periodically for pan-Hellenic festivals, most famously the Olympic Games, where athletes from different polis compete, and temporary truces allow safe passage even during wartime. They share myths and legends, epic poems that tell of common ancestors and ancient glories. They trade with each other, intermarry occasionally, consult the same oracles. But these threads of connection are gossamer thin compared to the thick bonds of local loyalty and identity that define everyday political life. More often than not, the polis are rivals, even enemies. They fight each other over boundary disputes, trade advantages, ancient grudges that have festered for generations. Athens and Sparta, the two great powers, regard each other with suspicion and competing visions of how Greek society should be organized. Smaller cities play the larger ones against each other, seeking advantage in the shifting balance of power. Alliances form and dissolve with bewildering rapidity. Today's ally may be tomorrow's enemy. The idea of a unified Greek response to any external threat is, at best, a fragile possibility, at worst, a naive fantasy. This fragmentation is both Greece's weakness and, paradoxically, part of its peculiar strength. The lack of centralized authority means no single defeat can destroy Greek civilization entirely. But it also means that coordinating a common defense against a threat like Persia requires overcoming deep-seated rivalries, mistrust, and the simple practical difficulty of getting independent cities to agree on anything at all. When news arrives that Xerxes is preparing his massive invasion, when it becomes clear that the Persian host will dwarf anything the Greeks have faced before, the police must somehow decide how to respond. Some cities, particularly those in northern Greece closest to the invasion route, choose accommodation. They see the size of the Persian force, calculate their own limited resources, and decide that resistance is futile. Better to offer earth and water, the traditional symbols of submission, and hope for favourable treatment within the empire. Others, distant from the immediate threat or confident in their natural defences, adopt a wait-and-see approach. They make no commitment either way, preserving their options, unwilling to risk destruction but equally unwilling to submit without seeing how events unfold. But a core group of polis, led by Athens and Sparta, decides to resist. This decision is not unanimous even within individual cities. Debates rage in assemblies and councils. Factions argue for different courses of action. Some advocate submission, others withdrawal behind defensive walls, others active resistance. The choice to stand and fight is contested, uncertain, fraught with doubt and fear. Yet gradually, through a combination of diplomatic pressure, shared cultural identity, calculation of strategic advantage, and sheer stubborn pride, a coalition begins to form. The coalition is provisional from the start, held together more by immediate necessity than by any deep structural bonds. The cities that join agree to put aside their mutual grievances temporarily, to pool their military resources to coordinate their defensive strategy. But trust is limited. Athens and Sparta, the dual pillars of the resistance, have different political systems, different military strengths, different visions of Greek society. The Athenians pride themselves on their democracy, their naval power, their commercial energy. The Spartans maintain their rigid military culture, their hereditary kingship, their disdain for trade and innovation. Smaller polis watch nervously as these two powers negotiate leadership roles, each worried about being dominated by the other or caught in the crossfire of their rivalry. The coalition settles on a compromise for military command. Sparta, with its reputation for military excellence and its formidable infantry, provides the supreme commander. But Athens, with its large fleet, controls the naval strategy. The choice of Leonidas, one of Sparta's two kings, to lead the land forces is partly practical, partly symbolic. He is experienced, respected, and his willingness to take the field himself signals Sparta's genuine commitment to the common defence. Yet even with leadership nominally settled, the coalition remains fragile. Each contributing city retains ultimate sovereignty over its own forces. Contingents can be withdrawn if their home polis decides the risk is too great. Unity exists, but it is unity held together by shared fear and tenuous hope, not by any permanent institutional structure. As the Persian advance draws closer, as scouts bring reports of the enemy's size and progress, the fragility of this Greek coalition becomes both its greatest weakness and its most remarkable feature. That these jealous, independent, often hostile cities could cooperate at all is something approaching a political miracle. That they would maintain that cooperation under the pressure of imminent invasion remains uncertain. The coalition exists, but barely. It could shatter at any moment. Everything depends on the choices made in the coming days, on whether fear of Persian domination can overcome the centrifugal forces that normally keep the Greek world fragmented and divided. The Greek coalition faces a fundamental problem of asymmetry. Intelligence reports filtering back from scouts and spies paint a daunting picture of the Persian force gathering in the north. The numbers are staggering, almost incomprehensible. Even if the ancient sources exaggerate, as they surely do, the reality remains overwhelming. The Persians will come with a host that dwarfs anything the Greeks can possibly assemble. In open battle, on level ground where both armies can deploy fully, the sheer weight of Persian numbers would likely prove decisive. The Greeks would be surrounded, outflanked, crushed beneath the mass of enemy forces. This is the cold strategic calculus that Greek commanders must confront. Yet there is precedent for hope. A decade earlier at Marathon, Athenian hoplites defeated a Persian landing force through discipline, superior armour, and tactical skill. That victory proved that Persians could be beaten, that their armies were not invincible, that Greek heavy infantry fighting in close formation possessed advantages that could offset numerical disadvantage. But Marathon was a relatively small engagement, a punitive expedition rather than a full invasion. What Xerxes brings now is something entirely different in scale and intent. The lesson of Marathon is encouraging but insufficient. The Greeks need something more than battlefield courage and disciplined spearwork. They need a strategic framework that turns their weakness into strength, that transforms the Persian advantage of numbers into a liability. The answer lies in geography. If the Greeks cannot hope to match Persian numbers in open battle, they must find places where numbers cease to matter, where terrain itself becomes an ally, where the normal calculations of warfare are disrupted by the contours of the land. A narrow pass, a bottleneck, a place where only a limited frontage can be engaged at any one time. In such a location, 10,000 attackers become no more effective than 1,000, because only the soldiers at the front can actually fight. The rest stand uselessly behind, unable to bring their weapons to bear, their presence contributing nothing but logistical burden. The Greek commanders study their maps and consult those who know the geography of northern routes. Several defensive positions are considered. There is the Vale of Tempe in Thessaly, a narrow valley through which armies must pass coming south from Macedonia. But scouts report that the valley can be bypassed, that other routes exist for an army willing to take a longer path. A position that can be flanked is no position at all. The defence must be at a point where geography compels the enemy to meet you on your terms, where there is no easy alternative route, where the bottleneck is genuine and unavoidable. Thermopylae emerges as the logical choice. The coastal pass between mountain and sea is narrow enough to negate numerical superiority. The mountains behind it are steep enough to prevent easy flanking manoeuvres. The sea beside it is shallow and rocky, difficult for ships to navigate close to shore. An army coming south along the coastal route must go through the pass. There is no practical alternative. The terrain offers exactly what the Greeks need, a natural fortification where disciplined infantry can hold against vastly larger forces, where the Persian advantage collapses into irrelevance. But the strategic value of Thermopylae extends beyond mere defensibility. The pass is not simply a place to make a heroic last stand. It is a position that protects multiple Greek interests simultaneously. By holding Thermopylae, the Greek coalition defends the approach to central Greece, buying time for cities further south to prepare, their defences, to evacuate populations if necessary, to position fleets strategically. The pass also sits near the coast, allowing coordination with the Greek naval forces that will be engaging the Persian fleet nearby at Artemisium. If both the land pass and the sea route can be held, the entire Persian advance is stalled. The strategy is not simply about fighting bravely and dying well. It is about controlling space, buying time, maintaining the integrity of the coalition by demonstrating that resistance is viable. The decision to deploy to Thermopylae is reached through council and debate among the allied cities. Various commanders voice their opinions, their concerns, their strategic calculations. There is discussion of how many troops to commit, which cities will contribute contingents, how long the position can realistically be held. Some argue for a larger force, others suggest that too many men would be wasted in a narrow pass where only the front ranks can fight. The compromise that emerges reflects both military logic and political reality. Send enough troops to mount a credible defence, but not so many that cities are left undefended or that resources are squandered in a single position. Leonidas, the Spartan king chosen to command the expedition, accepts the assignment with full awareness of its difficulties. He is not a young man seeking glory, but an experienced warrior and political leader who understands what the pass represents both tactically and symbolically. His willingness to take the field personally carries weight. It signals to other cities that Sparta is genuinely committed to the common defence, that this is not merely a token gesture or a delaying action to be abandoned at the first sign of pressure. His presence lends credibility to the defensive strategy. The force that assembles to march north toward Thermopylae is modest by the standards of the Persian host it will face. Roughly 7,000 men, drawn from multiple cities, each contingent bringing its own armour and weapons, its own officers, and unit cohesion. The Spartan contingent at the core numbers only 300, an elite guard of full citizens chosen for their experience and reliability. Around them cluster the contributions from other cities, Thespians and Thebans, Phocians and Locrians, each adding their strength to the collective defence. It is not an enormous army. It is barely a major force by Greek standards. But it is large enough to hold the narrow pass, and that is what matters. The strategy does not require defeating the Persians in open battle. It requires holding a geographic choke point long enough to disrupt the invasion timetable, to give the Greek coalition breathing room, to prove that resistance is possible. Thermopylae is chosen not as a place to seek glory, but as a place where geography and discipline might, just possibly, achieve what numbers alone cannot. To understand what makes the Greek defence at Thermopylae viable at all, you must look beyond courage and determination, beyond the myths of superhuman warriors, and examine instead the system that underpins Greek infantry warfare. The foundation of that system is the hoplite, a type of heavy infantryman whose name derives from the hoplon, the large round shield he carries. The hoplite is not defined by individual prowess or personal heroism, but by his role within a collective formation, by his willingness to subordinate his own survival instincts to the needs of the unit, by his training in a very specific mode of close-quarters combat that depends entirely on coordination with the men beside him. Consider the equipment first, for it shapes everything about how hoplites fight. The shield, or aspis, is the most important piece. It is large, roughly 3 feet in diameter, constructed of wood covered with bronze facing. It weighs perhaps 15 to 17 pounds, heavy enough that holding it extended for long periods requires considerable strength and endurance. But the shield's weight is not its most significant feature. What matters is how it is held. The hoplite slides his left arm through a bronze armband near the shield's rim and grips a leather handle near the centre. This grip means the shield extends beyond the left side of his body, covering not just himself, but also the right side of the man standing to his left. In turn, the shield of the man on his right covers his own vulnerable right side. The system only works if every man maintains his position, if no one breaks formation or turns away. Individual cowardice or panic creates a gap in the shield wall that endangers everyone. The primary weapon is the doru, a spear roughly 7 to 9 feet in length, made of ash or cornel wood with an iron spearhead at one end and a bronze spike at the other. The hoplite holds this spear overhand or underhand, thrusting it forward over or around the top rim of his shield. The spear gives reach, allowing the hoplite to strike at enemies while remaining partially protected behind his shield. When spears break or are lost, hoplites draw short swords, xiphos blades designed for stabbing rather than slashing, effective in the compressed chaos of close combat but distinctly secondary weapons. The defensive equipment varies by wealth and period. A bronze breastplate, either a solid cuirass or a corselet made of layered linen, protects the torso. Bronze greaves guard the shins. A bronze helmet, often of the Corinthian style with cheek guards and a nose guard, protects the head while severely limiting peripheral vision and hearing. The total weight of this panoply can reach 60 to 70 pounds, a considerable burden to carry and fight in. Hoplites are not lightly equipped skirmishers who can run and maneuver freely. They are heavily armoured shock troops designed for one very specific tactical purpose: to stand in close formation and grind down enemy infantry through sustained pressure and coordinated violence. The Formation itself, the phalanx, is where individual equipment and training coalesce into a collective fighting system. Hoplites stand shoulder to shoulder in ranks, typically 8 men deep, though this can vary based on numbers and terrain. The front rank presents a wall of overlapping shields and projecting spear points. The ranks behind push forward physically, adding their weight and momentum to the formation, ready to step forward if a front rank fighter falls. The phalanx moves forward slowly, deliberately, maintaining cohesion. Its power comes not from speed or maneuverability, but from mass and disciplined cohesion. It is a human battering ram designed to push through enemy lines to maintain relentless forward pressure until the opposing formation breaks. The phalanx has distinct advantages and equally distinct vulnerabilities. Its frontal strength is formidable. An enemy facing a phalanx head-on confronts a wall of bronze shields, a bristling hedge of spear points, and the psychological weight of men moving forward in unison. Light infantry, skirmishers with bows or javelins, cannot easily break a phalanx unless they catch it in broken terrain or from an unexpected angle. Even enemy heavy infantry must match the phalanx's cohesion and discipline or be pushed back and shattered. But the phalanx is almost helpless if attacked from the sides or rear. The shields face forward, the formation is deep rather than wide, and turning the entire mass to meet a flank attack is extraordinarily difficult. Cavalry charging into the flank of a phalanx can devastate it. Infantry working around behind can cause panic and collapse. The phalanx is only as strong as the terrain and tactical situation allow it to be. This is where the Spartans distinguished themselves, not through superhuman strength or mystical warrior magic, but through an intensity and focus of training that produces exceptional unit cohesion and discipline. Spartan boys enter the agoge, the state-run education and training system, at age 7. Their childhood and adolescence are devoted to physical conditioning, weapons drill, and the inculcation of group loyalty. They learn to move as a unit, to maintain formation under pressure, to subordinate individual survival to collective success. By the time a Spartan reaches full citizenship and takes his place in the phalanx, he has spent literally decades training for that role. The result is not invincibility but reliability. Spartan hoplites are less likely to panic, less likely to break formation, more capable of executing complex maneuvers under stress. They are a professional infantry corps in an era when most hoplites are citizen soldiers who train periodically but spend most of their time farming or trading. The 300 Spartans at Thermopylae represent this martial culture at its peak. They are not the youngest or the strongest, but the most experienced, men selected for their proven steadiness and skill. They have fought in previous battles, maintained cohesion through chaos and bloodshed, demonstrated the psychological resilience that keeps a phalanx intact when lesser formations would dissolve. Around this core of Spartan reliability cluster, the contingents from other cities, men trained in the same basic system of hoplite warfare but perhaps less intensively, less consistently. Together they form a defensive force whose effectiveness depends not on supernatural prowess but on training, equipment, discipline, and the strategic amplification that narrow terrain provides. They are men, not demigods, but they are men who have mastered a very specific and effective military system, and they are about to deploy that system in terrain ideally suited to its strengths. The legend remembers 300 Spartans standing alone against the Persian tide, a small band of elite warriors facing impossible odds with superhuman courage. The image is powerful, romantic, satisfying in its simplicity, but like so many historical legends, it obscures as much as it reveals. The truth is more complex, more fragmented, and in its own way more interesting than the streamlined myth. At Thermopylae, alongside those 300 Spartans, stand thousands of other Greeks, men from smaller cities whose names are rarely spoken, whose contributions are often forgotten, whose motivations and fears and hopes deserve equal attention. The total Greek force at the pass numbers somewhere around 7,000 men, a substantial contingent though still dwarfed by the Persian host bearing down from the north. The Spartans, those famous 300, are merely the elite corps, the professional soldiers whose training and reputation lend credibility to the entire enterprise. But they cannot hold the pass alone. They need numbers to defend multiple points, to rotate men through the fighting line, to maintain the depth and cohesion that makes a phalanx effective. The other Greek cities provide those numbers, each contributing what it can, what it judges appropriate to the risk and the cause. The Thespians send 700 hoplites, a remarkably large contingent from a relatively small city. Their commitment is striking, their willingness to stand at Thermopylae reflecting either genuine conviction in the necessity of resistance, or perhaps political calculation that aligning fully with Sparta and Athens will serve their long-term interests. Whatever their motivation, they will prove steadfast. When the moment comes for others to withdraw, the Thespians will remain, fighting and dying alongside the Spartans they came to support. History will barely remember their names, but their sacrifice will be no less real than that of the more famous warriors beside them. The Thebans contribute a contingent of 400 men, though their loyalty remains questionable throughout. Thebes is a city caught between competing pressures. Some Thebans favour resistance to Persia, believing that Greek independence is worth defending. Others see accommodation as the wiser path, calculating that the Persian Empire will prevail regardless, and that early submission will secure better treatment than stubborn defiance. The 400 Thebans at Thermopylae may be there partly as hostages, insurance against their city's potential betrayal, men whose presence guarantees that Thebes has skin in the game. Their motivations are murky, their commitment uncertain. When the end comes, some will surrender rather than die, a choice that will be remembered with scorn but which reflects the genuine ambivalence many Greeks feel about this conflict. The Phocians send 1,000 men, the Locrians contribute their forces, smaller cities add their modest contingents. Each contribution represents a decision made in council or assembly back home, a weighing of risks and obligations, a calculation about where safety and honour lie. These are not professional soldiers marching to war with the confidence of Spartan training behind them. Many are citizen farmers, men who own enough property to afford hoplite equipment, but who spend most of their time working land, not drilling in formation. They have families, farms, businesses back home. Their cities are small, vulnerable, unable to afford heavy losses. Yet they march to Thermopylae, take their places in the defensive line, prepare to face an enemy that outnumbers them by factors they can barely comprehend. Why do they come? The motivations are surely mixed, varying from man to man and city to city. Some are driven by genuine belief in Greek freedom, by the conviction that submission to Persian rule would mean the end of their city's autonomy and their own political rights. Others come because their cities are in the direct path of the invasion, and they have little choice but to fight or flee. Some are motivated by shame, by the knowledge that failing to contribute to the common defence would mark their city as cowardly or treacherous. Some may harbour personal ambitions, hoping that distinguished service will bring honour and political advantage back home. Some are simply following orders, conscripted or pressured into service by civic authorities who made the decision for them. The alliance holding these men together at Thermopylae is fragile, built on provisional agreements and temporary unity of purpose. The contingents from different cities retain their own command structures, their own leaders, their own internal loyalties. A Thespian hoplite stands beside a Spartan but owes his primary allegiance to Thespiae, not to some abstract notion of Greek unity. If his city decides the cause is lost and orders a withdrawal, he will leave. The coalition exists only as long as enough cities continue to believe that resistance serves their interests better than submission or flight. There is no overarching authority compelling these men to stay, no central government with the power to enforce discipline across city-state boundaries. They are here by choice, however reluctant or contingent that choice might be. This fragility makes what happens at Thermopylae more remarkable, not less. That these disparate groups manage to coordinate their defence, to fight together with reasonable effectiveness, to maintain their positions for multiple days against overwhelming pressure, speaks to a kind of resilience that transcends the formal weakness of their alliance. They are held together not by institutional bonds but by shared identity as Hellenes, by mutual recognition that their cities' fates are intertwined, by the simple practical reality that breaking formation and fleeing individually offers little chance of survival. So when we remember Thermopylae, we should remember not just 300 Spartans but 7,000 Greeks. Not just the professional warriors at the core but the ordinary hoplites around them, the farmers and merchants and craftsmen who left their homes to stand in a narrow pass against an empire. Not just the famous names but the anonymous multitudes whose graves were never marked, whose stories were never told, whose contribution to the defence has been eclipsed by the brighter legend of Spartan heroism. They stood there too. They fought and bled and died there too. The pass would not have been held without them. Their cities, small and vulnerable, made the choice to resist. That choice, multiplied across multiple polis, fragile and contingent as it was, is what made the defence of Thermopylae possible at all. You walk with them now, with the columns of hoplites moving south along the dusty roads that thread through the Greek countryside toward Thermopylae. The sun climbs high in a cloudless sky, beating down with the particular intensity of late summer in the Mediterranean. The heat presses against your skin, radiates up from the packed earth beneath your sandals, shimmers in wavering lines above the distant hills. Each step raises small puffs of dust that hang in the still air before settling slowly back to earth. The dust coats your legs, infiltrates the weave of your tunic, dries your throat until you long for the next rest stop where you can drink from a water skin or a roadside spring. The march is not swift. An army moves at the pace of its slowest members, constrained by the weight they carry, the distance that must be covered, the need to maintain some degree of order and cohesion. Each hoplite bears his panoply, the full burden of shield and spear, helmet and greaves, breastplate and sword. Some carry their armour on their backs to spare themselves the added weight during the march, but even disassembled and packed, the bronze and wood and leather are heavy. You feel it in your shoulders, in the ache that builds in your lower back, in the gradual fatigue that accumulates with each mile travelled. The shield especially becomes burdensome, its weight dragging at your arm, its rim catching against your hip as you walk. Around you, the landscape shifts slowly. The march began perhaps in the Peloponnese, or from cities in central Greece closer to the pass. You travel through olive groves where ancient trees twist their gnarled trunks toward the sun, past fields where farmers pause in their work to watch the armed men filing by. You cross low ridges where wild herbs scent the air with thyme and oregano. You descend into valleys where streams run cool and clear, offering brief respite where you can splash water on your face and refill your drinking vessels. Always to your left or right, depending on the specific route, you sense the sea. Sometimes you see it, that blue expanse glittering under the sun. Other times you only smell it, the salt tang carried inland on the breeze, mixing with the dust and sweat and leather. The sounds of the march create their own rhythm, thousands of sandaled feet striking the earth in rough unison, not the precise cadence of modern military drill, but a looser, more organic pattern. The creak of leather straps, the metallic clink of bronze pieces shifting against each other, the occasional clatter when someone stumbles or adjusts their burden. Voices rise and fall in conversation, though as the day wears on and fatigue accumulates, the talk becomes more sporadic. Men save their breath for walking. Some sing, old marching songs or hymns to the gods, the melodies helping to mark time and maintain spirits. Some remain silent, lost in their own thoughts, perhaps thinking of the homes they left behind, the families they may or may not see again. You notice the different contingents maintaining their separate identities even in the common march. The Spartans move with a distinctive discipline, their column orderly, their pace steady. They have done this before, marched to campaigns in the Peloponnese, fought in the constant low-level conflicts that characterize relations among Greek cities. For them, this march is routine, familiar, though the destination and the scale of what awaits make it different from previous expeditions. The contingents from smaller cities seem less polished, their formations looser, their equipment more varied in quality and style. But they keep moving, maintaining the pace, carrying their burdens south toward whatever destiny awaits at the pass. Rest comes in stages through the day. You halt in the heat of midday, seeking what shade can be found under trees or rocky outcrops. Men lower their burdens with relief, sit or sprawl on the ground, drink deeply from whatever water sources are available. Some eat the simple rations they carry, dried figs or barley bread, perhaps cheese if they have it, olives from their provisions. Others simply rest, conserving energy for the afternoon's continuation. Officers move among the groups, checking equipment, addressing concerns, maintaining the minimal level of organization needed to resume the march when rest time ends. The afternoon march is harder than the morning. Bodies already tired must be pushed forward again. The heat remains intense. The dust seems thicker, more oppressive. Blisters form where sandal straps rub against skin. Shoulders ache under the weight of armour. Yet the columns continue, placing one foot ahead of the other, covering the miles that separate them from Thermopylae. Some men begin to limp, nursing injuries or simple exhaustion. Others develop that 1,000-yard stare of men pushed beyond normal endurance, moving forward through force of will and group momentum rather than any remaining physical comfort. As evening approaches, the heat finally begins to ease. The sun descends toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The light softens, becomes golden and forgiving. A breeze rises, cooler now, carrying the scent of salt more strongly. You know the sea is closer. You're approaching the northern coastal route, nearing the region where Thermopylae lies. The knowledge brings a mixture of emotions: relief that the day's march is ending, that rest and food and sleep await at the evening's camp. But also a tightening in the chest, a recognition that each mile south brings you closer to the pass, to the confrontation that cannot be avoided, to whatever fate the next days hold. When the column finally halts for the night, you feel the communal relief ripple through the ranks. Men lower their burdens with audible sighs, stretch their aching backs, begin the familiar routines of making camp. Fires are lit, simple meals prepared, equipment checked and maintained. Guards are posted to watch through the night. The camp becomes a temporary village of exhausted men, talking quietly, tending to minor injuries, sharpening weapons, writing or dictating letters home if they have the means and literacy. Some pray, making private offerings to whatever gods they particularly revere, asking for protection in the coming ordeal. Others simply lie down and sleep, too tired for ceremony or contemplation, seeking the oblivion of exhausted rest. You settle yourself among them, feeling the accumulated fatigue in every muscle. The ground beneath you is hard but welcome. The night air is cool against your skin. Above, stars begin to emerge in the deepening blue of the sky. Tomorrow you will rise and march again, moving ever closer to Thermopylae. But for now, for these few hours of darkness, you can rest. The pass awaits, patient and inevitable, but it can wait until morning. Now shift your perspective across the landscape to the north, to the great host that moves slowly southward along the coastal route toward the narrow pass that awaits. This is the Persian army, the instrument of Xerxes' ambition, and to understand what approaches Thermopylae you must set aside the legendary numbers that ancient sources record, the millions upon millions that Herodotus claimed darkened the earth and drank rivers dry. Modern scholarship, examining the logistics of moving and supplying such a force, suggests something more modest yet still overwhelming by Greek standards. Perhaps 120,000 soldiers, perhaps as many as 300,000 when you count support personnel and camp followers. The exact number remains uncertain, but the reality is staggering enough without mythical exaggeration. This is the largest military expedition the Greek world has yet faced. What makes this army remarkable is not simply its size, but its composition, its fundamental nature as an imperial force drawn from across a vast multicultural domain. The Persian Empire does not rely on a single ethnic group or culture to fill its military ranks. Instead, it draws contingents from every corner of its territory, each satrapy contributing its quota of soldiers, each region providing men equipped and trained in their own traditional manner. The result is not a uniform host, but a tapestry of peoples, languages, fighting styles, and motivations, all moving together under the authority of the great king. At the core are the Persians themselves and their close cousins, the Medes, the dominant peoples of the empire's heartland. These are the empire's elite troops, the most trusted and best equipped. Persian infantry wear scale armour, carry spears and short swords, fight with the confidence of conquerors who have built this empire through generations of successful warfare. The Immortals, the great king's personal guard, number 10,000, so named because their ranks are immediately filled when casualties occur, maintaining the unit's strength at a constant level. They represent the pinnacle of Persian military professionalism, career soldiers rather than conscripted farmers, men whose loyalty to the empire is absolute. But around this Persian core cluster contingents from dozens of other peoples. Babylonians march in the column, soldiers from the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, their equipment and tactics reflecting traditions that stretch back millennia before the Persians ever rose to prominence. Assyrians contribute their contingent, warriors from a people whose own empire once dominated this region, now reduced to subject status but still valuable for their military skills. Egyptians walk among the host, soldiers from the Nile Valley whose homeland fell to Persian conquest only decades earlier, their presence a reminder of the empire's reach into Africa. From the eastern satrapies come soldiers whose homelands lie far beyond Greek knowledge or imagination. Bactrians and Sogdians from the regions near the edges of the known world, men who speak languages incomprehensible to both Greeks and Persians, who worship gods unfamiliar to Mediterranean peoples, who fight with composite bows and light cavalry tactics developed on the steppes. Indians from the Indus Valley, representatives of yet another ancient civilization absorbed into the imperial structure, bring their own distinctive weapons and armour. The diversity is staggering, a living demonstration of the empire's geographic and cultural reach. Along the Aegean coast and in Asia Minor, the empire has conscripted Greeks, the Ionians who live under Persian rule, and who have little choice but to contribute to the invasion of their ethnic cousins across the sea. These Greek subjects provide ships for the Persian fleet, sailors and marines who know the waters and the language. Their loyalty is questionable, their presence a constant reminder of the complex politics of empire, where subject peoples must be used but cannot be entirely trusted, where practical necessity overrides ideological purity. Some Ionian Greeks serve willingly, calculating that their interests lie with Persian power. Others serve reluctantly, pressed into service by local authorities, harbouring secret sympathies for the cities they march against. The languages spoken in this vast camp are legion: Persian and Median in the command tents, Aramaic as an administrative lingua franca, but also Babylonian and Egyptian, Greek and Phoenician, Bactrian and Elamite, a dozen other tongues in smaller groups gathered around their own fires. The army communicates through translators and interpreters, through gestures and demonstrations, through the universal military language of orders and drill that transcends specific words. The armour varies wildly from contingent to contingent. Persians in their scale armour, Egyptians in linen corselets, some groups in bronze breastplates, others in quilted textile protection, still others fighting essentially unarmoured with only shields for defence. The weapons similarly range across the spectrum of ancient military technology, from the sophisticated composite bows of the steppe peoples to simple spears and clubs. The motivations for being here, for marching toward Greece, vary as widely as the peoples themselves. For the Persian core, this is imperial duty, service to the great king, continuation of the conquest that brought their people from a highland kingdom to masters of the known world. For many subject peoples, service is simply what is demanded by the empire that rules them. They have no choice, no ability to refuse conscription, no realistic alternative to obedience. Some may harbour resentment at being forced to fight in a war that means nothing to them personally. Others may see military service as a path to advancement, a way to prove loyalty and gain favour within the imperial system. Still others may be genuinely inspired by the scale of the enterprise, caught up in the momentum of a great expedition, finding meaning in being part of something vast and historical. The logistical challenge of moving and supplying such a diverse host is immense. Food must be gathered from the territories the army passes through, supplemented by supply trains bringing provisions from bases further north. Water sources must be identified and secured. The army cannot simply forage freely without devastating the countryside and alienating populations that the empire may wish to incorporate peacefully. Routes must be scouted, bridges built or commandeered, camps established each night with some degree of security and organisation. The sheer mechanics of coordinating so many different groups, ensuring they all move in roughly the same direction, at roughly the same pace, represents an administrative achievement in itself. This is the force approaching Thermopylae. Not a faceless horde, not an undifferentiated mass of enemies, but a complex human system, an empire's population in miniature, moving with all the friction and difficulty that such diversity entails. They are men, just as the Greeks waiting at the pass are men. They have homes and families, hopes and fears. They fight for various reasons with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The empire has assembled them, pointed them south, and set them in motion. Now they march toward a narrow pass where all their diversity and numbers will be compressed into a space barely wide enough to matter. The morning arrives with the inevitability of all mornings, the sun rising over the eastern mountains to paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. You have been awake for hours already, unable to sleep through the tension and anticipation that grips the Greek camp. Around you, men prepare themselves with quiet efficiency, checking armour straps, testing shield grips, sharpening spear points that are already sharp. Some murmur prayers to gods they hope are listening. Others stand silent, faces blank with the particular stillness that comes before violence. You settle your helmet onto your head, feeling the bronze close around your skull, the cheek guards narrowing your field of vision, the nose guard bisecting your view of the world. The world becomes a bronze-framed tunnel, your hearing muffled by the metal encasing your head. The Persian army appears on the northern approach as the sun climbs higher. You see them first as a distant mass, a darkness on the horizon that gradually resolves into columns of men, thousands upon thousands, more soldiers than you have ever seen in one place. They advance slowly, deliberately, their numbers seeming to fill the landscape, to press against the mountains on one side and the sea on the other. The sight should be terrifying, and perhaps it is, but you stand in the phalanx now, shoulder pressed against the man to your right, shield overlapping the shield of the man to your left. In the compression of the formation, individual fear becomes subsumed into collective purpose. You are not alone facing this tide. You are part of a wall, a system, a mechanism designed for exactly this moment. The Persians deploy what forces they can in the constricted space before the pass. You see their front ranks forming, soldiers settling into position, archers preparing their bows. Orders are shouted in languages you do not understand. Officers move among the enemy formations, making final adjustments. Then, at some signal you cannot see, the advance begins. The first wave moves forward, not charging wildly, but advancing with purpose toward the Greek line holding the narrowest point of the pass. You grip your spear more tightly, feeling the wood smooth under your palm, your shield heavy on your left arm. Your breath comes faster now, shallow and quick, despite your efforts to control it. The arrows come first, a dark cloud rising from the Persian ranks, arcing high against the blue sky before descending toward the Greek position. You crouch slightly behind your shield, hearing the arrows strike bronze and wood with hollow impacts. Most deflect harmlessly off the overlapping shields of the phalanx. Some find gaps, and you hear cries as men are struck, but the formation holds. The arrows continue, wave after wave, the Persians attempting to soften the Greek line before committing infantry. But a hoplite phalanx is designed to withstand exactly this kind of missile barrage. The shields overlap, the armor protects vital areas, the men crouch low and wait with the patience of those who understand their system's strengths. When the Persian infantry finally closes to contact, the real work begins. They advance into spear range, and the Greek front rank thrusts forward, long doru spears projecting over and around shield rims. The Persian soldiers wear lighter armor, carry shorter weapons, lack the massed cohesion of the phalanx. They press forward bravely, throwing themselves against the Greek line, but the narrow pass prevents them from bringing their numbers to bear effectively. Only a limited number can engage at any moment, perhaps a few dozen men along the narrowest section of the front. Behind them, thousands more stand uselessly, unable to contribute to the fighting, their presence meaningless in the compressed geography. You thrust your spear forward mechanically, not aiming at individuals but simply projecting the weapon into the space where enemies are trying to advance. The bronze spearhead connects with flesh or shield or armor, you cannot always tell which. You pull the spear back and thrust again, and again, a rhythm dictated by the press of bodies around you, by the shouted commands of officers behind the formation, by the instinctive understanding that emerges from training and necessity. The man to your left grunts with effort, his spear finding a target. The man to your right stumbles slightly but recovers, maintained in position by the press of bodies. The phalanx functions not through individual heroics, but through collective pressure, through the simple reality that 7,000 men pushing forward with locked shields and projecting spears cannot be easily broken by infantry attacking a few dozen at a time. The sound is overwhelming even through your helmet's muffling. Bronze on bronze creates a particular ringing impact, metal on wood a duller thud. Men shout, though whether in rage or fear or simply effort, you cannot tell. The wounded cry out in pain. Orders are yelled from somewhere behind you, instructions to hold position, to dress the line, to maintain cohesion. Your world narrows to the immediate space around you, to the shield pressed against your shoulder, to the spear in your hand, to the act of breathing in the stifling heat building inside your bronze helmet. Time becomes difficult to measure. The fighting might last minutes or hours. You lose track in the repetitive violence, in the physical exhaustion that accumulates with each thrust of the spear, each moment of holding your shield position against the pressure from your left. Periodically, the Persian attacks ebb, the front ranks pulling back to be replaced by fresh troops. The phalanx rotates its own men, bringing forward soldiers from the rear ranks to relieve those who have been fighting in the front line. You find yourself pulled back, another hoplite taking your position, and you stand gasping in the relative safety of the second rank, your arms trembling from sustained effort, your throat raw and dry. The day wears on. Wave after wave of Persian infantry attempts to break through the pass. Different units try their luck, soldiers from various parts of the empire testing themselves against the Greek line. None succeed. The narrow space will not allow them to deploy effectively. The phalanx, designed precisely for this kind of defensive stand, holds its ground. The pile of dead and wounded before the Greek position grows, Persian casualties accumulating in the constricted space, becoming themselves an obstacle that makes the advance more difficult. As the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, the Persian attacks finally cease. The enemy pulls back, leaving their dead, allowing both sides to catch their breath. You stand in the phalanx, exhausted beyond any fatigue you have previously known, your armor drenched with sweat, your muscles screaming, but the line held. The pass remains in Greek hands. For one day at least, the strategy has worked. Geography has neutralized Persian numbers. Discipline and training have overcome numerical disadvantage. You're still alive, still standing. Tomorrow will bring another test, but tonight belongs to a kind of grim satisfaction. The system worked. The phalanx held. Night settles over the pass with the particular stillness that follows violence. The fighting has ceased, both sides pulling back to their respective positions, and in the space between the Greek line and the Persian encampment lies the residue of the day's work. Bodies scattered across the narrow ground, some still, others moving weakly, crying out in languages Greek and Persian and dozens of others. The living do not venture into that contested space to retrieve the fallen. There will be time for that later, perhaps, or perhaps not. For now, the dead and dying lie where they fell, offerings to whatever gods watch over battlefields. You sit with your back against the rough stone of the pass wall, your helmet finally removed, breathing air that tastes of salt and copper and dust. Your hands tremble slightly, the adrenaline that sustained you through the fighting now ebbing away, leaving only exhaustion and a peculiar hollowness. Around you, other hoplites rest in similar postures, some speaking quietly to companions, others sitting in silence, staring at nothing or at something only they can see. The normal sounds of an evening camp, the preparation of food, the maintenance of equipment, the casual conversation of men at ease, all of it continues but muted, subdued by the weight of what has just passed and the knowledge of what tomorrow will bring. The wounded are being tended in a section of the camp set aside for that purpose. You hear them even from here, the groans and occasional cries of men in pain. Greek medicine is practical but limited. Wounds are cleaned with wine or vinegar if available, bandaged with linen strips, sometimes cauterized if bleeding cannot be stopped by other means. The physicians and those with experience in battlefield surgery move among the injured, making assessments about who can be saved and who cannot. A grim calculus that no amount of training makes easier. Some wounds are survivable, a spear thrust to the arm or leg that missed major blood vessels, broken bones from falls or impacts, cuts that can be stitched and bandaged. Others are clearly fatal, and for those men the best that can be offered is water and quiet words and the presence of companions as they slip away. You notice the absence of certain faces, men who stood near you in the formation earlier, whose positions are now filled by others or left empty. You do not know if they are among the wounded or the dead. The phalanx does not encourage knowing individuals too well. The system works better when you think of the formation as a unit, rather than as a collection of distinct persons. Yet you cannot help but note the gaps, cannot stop yourself from wondering about the fates of men you stood beside, whose shields protected your vulnerable side, whose presence made the wall complete. Someone passes you a water skin and you drink deeply, the liquid warm and tasting of leather but welcome nonetheless. Someone else offers bread and olives, the standard campaign rations, and you eat mechanically, though you have no appetite. Your body needs fuel, needs to replace what the day's exertion burned away, and you force the food down with the discipline of a soldier who understands that tomorrow will demand as much or more than today did. The bread is coarse, the olives shriveled and salty, but they are food, and that is sufficient. As darkness deepens, small fires appear throughout the camp, carefully managed to provide minimal light and warmth without making the position too visible to the enemy. Men gather around these fires in small groups, drawn to the light and heat, to the companionship of others who shared the day's ordeal. You join one such group, finding a space among men whose faces are illuminated in flickering orange, their expressions alternating between shadow and light. The conversation is desultory, disconnected. Someone mentions a particularly close call, a spear that passed within inches of his head. Someone else describes the face of a Persian soldier in the moment before they engaged. Another sits silent, poking at the fire with a stick, lost in his own thoughts. There is discussion, quietly conducted, about how long the position can be held. The first day proved the strategic concept sound, showed that the narrow pass does indeed neutralize Persian numerical advantage, but it also demonstrated the cost. Even against vastly superior numbers, even with terrain entirely in their favour, the Greeks suffered casualties. Men fell to arrows that found gaps in the defensive formation. Men were wounded in the close fighting, pulled back from the line only to die later from blood loss or shock. The wounded cannot fight tomorrow. The dead obviously cannot. Each day of defence gradually erodes the force available to maintain the phalanx. How many such days can be sustained before the Greek numbers drop below the threshold needed to hold the line? Some speak of reinforcements, of additional contingents that might be marching north even now to support the defence. Others express scepticism, pointing out that the fragile coalition of Greek cities might be fracturing already, that some polis, seeing the size of the Persian force, might be reconsidering their commitment to resistance. The strategic value of holding Thermopylae is clear, but strategic clarity does not always translate into sustained political will. Each city must weigh its own interests, its own survival, against the abstract benefit of the common defence. A runner arrives from the command group, speaking briefly with officers, before departing again. Word filters through the camp that there were envoys, that the Persians sent representatives under a flag of truce, that terms were offered. The details are vague, passed from man to man, probably garbled in the retelling. Something about surrender, about safe passage if the Greeks would simply abandon the pass. Something about the futility of resistance, about the inevitability of Persian victory. The offers were refused, obviously, or you would not still be sitting here in the pass. But the fact that offers were made suggests something about the Persian perspective. Perhaps Xerxes expected the pass to fall more easily. Perhaps the day's fighting convinced him that taking the position by frontal assault will be more costly than anticipated. Perhaps he hopes to achieve through negotiation what could not be quickly accomplished through force. You lean back against the stone wall, feeling its cool solidity against your shoulder blades. Above, stars emerge in the deepening darkness, the same constellations that have wheeled overhead since before humans built cities or forged bronze. The wars of men, the clash of empires and city-states, the defence of narrow passes, all of it plays out beneath those indifferent stars. You feel small suddenly, aware of your own fragility, of how easily a spear thrust or arrow flight could end your part in this story. Yet you also feel connected to something larger, to the collective choice that brought you here, to the thousands of other men making the same calculation about risk and duty and survival. The night wears on. Eventually you sleep, or something like sleep, a fitful rest interrupted by sounds and memories. Tomorrow will come regardless. The Persians will attack again. The phalanx will form again. The grinding work of defence will continue. But for now, in this quiet darkness, you simply rest. The pass holds, for one more night. That will have to be enough. What defeats the Greek position at Thermopylae is not superior Persian valour or tactical brilliance in the conventional sense. It is not a devastating new weapon or a brilliant flanking manoeuvre executed on the battlefield. The defeat comes instead from something quieter, more insidious, more human in its banality. It comes from knowledge, from the simple fact that local geography is known to local people and that knowledge can be shared or sold or given away. High above the coastal pass, hidden in the folds and creases of the Calidromus Mountains, runs a path. It is not a road in any formal sense, not something constructed with engineering or maintained with civic funds. It is a goat track, a shepherd's route, the kind of narrow trail that develops over generations as animals, and the people who tend them find the easiest way through difficult terrain. This path winds up the mountainside behind the Greek position, climbing through scrub and stone, threading between outcrops and gullies, ascending gradually until it crests the ridge and descends again on the far side of the pass. A person walking this path, if they knew it existed and could find its beginning, could move from the Persian-controlled territory north of Thermopylae to the Greek-controlled territory south of it without ever passing through the defended bottleneck. The path effectively negates the entire strategic advantage that terrain provides. What makes the narrow pass defensible is precisely that it cannot be easily bypassed, that armies must go through it rather than around it. But this assumption rests on the mountains being truly impassable, and mountains are rarely as impassable as military planners would like them to be. The Greek commanders are not entirely ignorant of this vulnerability. They know, in a general sense, that mountain paths might exist. They station a contingent of Phocian soldiers up on the heights, with instructions to guard against any attempt to use such routes. The Phocians, locals with knowledge of the region, should be well positioned to detect and block any flanking movement. But the defence of a mountain path in darkness, over terrain that offers multiple possible routes by soldiers, who are themselves exhausted and uncertain, proves more difficult than the straightforward defence of the coastal bottleneck. The system that works so well in the narrow pass, the overlapping shields and coordinated spearwork of the phalanx, has no application in the broken terrain of mountain slopes at night. The Persians learn of the path through betrayal, or perhaps merely through pragmatic information sharing, depending on how one wishes to characterize the transaction. Ancient sources, particularly Herodotus, name a local Greek man, Ephialtes, as the one who reveals the path's existence to Xerxes. The details remain murky across the millennia. Was Ephialtes motivated by money, by political calculation, by personal grievance against other Greeks, by simple survival instinct in the face of overwhelming Persian power? The sources do not provide clear answers, and perhaps the truth is some combination of factors that made sense to him at the time. What matters strategically is not his motivation, but the result. Knowledge passes from those who have it to those who can use it. The Persians learn that a path exists, that it can be traversed, that it offers a way to outflank the Greek position. Under cover of darkness, a Persian force begins the ascent. They move quietly, guided perhaps by Ephialtes himself or by others with local knowledge pressed into service. The climb is difficult, the path narrow and treacherous in darkness, but it is passable. Thousands of men, perhaps the Immortals or another elite unit trusted with this critical flanking maneuver, wind their way up the mountainside. They move slowly, carefully, maintaining silence as much as possible. The night conceals them from Greek observation. The Phocian guards stationed on the heights either fail to detect the movement or are overwhelmed when they do discover it. The Persian force crests the ridge and begins its descent toward the southern side of the pass. By morning, the strategic situation has transformed completely. The Greek position, so strong when facing frontal assault through the narrow pass, becomes untenable once the enemy appears behind it. A phalanx is designed to fight forward, to present a wall of shields and spears toward an enemy approaching from the front. It cannot easily turn to meet threats from multiple directions. It cannot defend against encirclement. The entire tactical advantage that made 7,000 Greeks capable of holding against 100,000 Persians evaporates once the terrain no longer constrains the Persian deployment. With forces both in front and behind, with the possibility of being surrounded and cut off from any line of retreat, the Greek position becomes not defensible, but suicidal. This is the moment when legend and reality diverge most sharply. The romantic version of Thermopylae emphasizes courage in the face of overwhelming odds, the noble decision to stand and die rather than retreat. And there is truth in that version, a genuine element of calculated sacrifice in what follows. But the underlying cause of the crisis is not some mystical commitment to heroic death. It is the simple tactical reality that the defensive position has been compromised, that the strategy based on holding a narrow choke point no longer applies once that choke point can be bypassed. The Greeks face a choice not between glory and shame, but between a fighting withdrawal that might save most of their force or a rearguard action that allows the bulk of the army to escape, while a small group covers their retreat. The path in the mountains, that obscure goat track known to shepherds and locals, becomes the pivot on which the entire battle turns. No amount of Greek discipline or Persian valour matters compared to this geographic fact. The narrow pass that made the defence possible is revealed to be vulnerable after all, its strength contingent on knowledge, on secrecy, on the assumption that difficult terrain is the same as impassable terrain. Mountains that seem like walls prove to have doors if you know where to look for them. The defence that seemed so clever, so perfectly matched to the strategic problem, collapses not through its failure, but through the revelation of an assumption it rested upon without fully examining. Geography still matters, but the geography is more complex than it appeared. The pass can be flanked, the position can be turned. The narrow corridor between mountain and sea offers no protection, once the mountain itself becomes a route for attack. The news arrives with the pre-dawn darkness still clinging to the eastern mountains. Scouts return from the heights, breathless and grim, bringing word that Persian forces have been spotted descending the mountain path behind the Greek position. The flanking movement has succeeded. The position is compromised. Leonidas receives the reports in the quiet way of experienced commanders, asking practical questions about numbers and timing, assessing how long before the encirclement becomes complete. The calculations are straightforward and unforgiving. The Greeks have perhaps hours, maybe less, before Persian forces appear on the southern side of the pass, cutting off the route of retreat. Once that happens, the entire Greek force will be trapped between the army to the north and the flanking force to the south. Surrounded, outnumbered by factors of 20 or 30 to 1, the phalanx will be compressed from all sides until it collapses. Every man will die or be captured. The coalition force assembled to hold the pass will be annihilated. This is the moment when leadership becomes something more complex than courage or tactical skill. Leonidas must make a choice that will determine not just his own fate but the fate of thousands, the perception of the Greek resistance, the morale of cities waiting anxiously for news from the north. The options are limited and none are attractive. He can order a general retreat immediately, hoping to extract the entire force before the trap closes. This might save the most lives but would abandon the pass without extracting any further delay of the Persian advance. It would also mean that the days of defence already fought, the casualties already suffered, would have achieved only a temporary inconvenience for Xerxes rather than any meaningful strategic advantage. The second option is to stand and fight to the end with the entire force, accepting encirclement and annihilation in exchange for the symbolic value of total resistance. This would certainly be dramatic, perhaps inspiring, but it would also destroy the Greek coalition's military capacity in a single pointless gesture. Leonidas chooses a third path, more calculated and more difficult. He orders most of the Greek contingents to withdraw immediately, to retreat south while the route remains open, to preserve their strength for future battles. The coalition must survive, must continue to resist, must maintain the fragile unity that brought these disparate cities together. Throwing away thousands of lives in a hopeless last stand serves no practical purpose beyond theatre. But he does not withdraw everyone. He and his 300 Spartans will remain. The 700 Thespians refuse to leave, insisting on staying with the Spartans to the end. Perhaps some Thebans stay as well, though their later surrender will complicate their historical memory. Perhaps a few others from various contingents choose to remain, or are chosen by lot, or by their officers to form the rearguard. The purpose is straightforward. Someone must hold the pass long enough for the main force to escape, must delay the Persian pursuit, must buy hours with lives. A rearguard action is among the most difficult military operations, requiring discipline and acceptance of almost certain death. The men who stay know they are unlikely to survive. They are not deluding themselves about heroic last-minute rescues or miraculous reversals. They understand the mathematics of the situation, but they also understand the value of time in warfare, how even a few hours of delay can mean the difference between an organised retreat and a panicked rout, between an army that survives to fight again and a coalition that dissolves in the chaos of disintegration. The decision weighs on everyone differently. For the Spartans, there is perhaps a certain grim satisfaction in the clarity of it. Their culture has prepared them for exactly this kind of sacrifice, has taught them from childhood that death in service to Sparta is not tragedy but fulfillment. The 300 are volunteers in the sense that every Spartan citizen soldier volunteers. By accepting his citizenship and the obligations it entails, they will stand because standing is what Spartans do, because their identity as Spartans demands it, because retreat would be a kind of civic and personal death worse than physical annihilation. This is not healthy in any universal sense, and we need not celebrate the particular rigidity of Spartan culture to recognize its effectiveness in producing men capable of this choice. The Thespians represent something different, perhaps more moving in its way. They are not Spartans. They have not spent their lives in the agog being shaped into instruments of state violence. They are simply Greeks from a small city who chose to come to Thermopylae, who fought alongside the Spartans for 2 days, and who now refuse to abandon them in the final hours. Their decision to stay is less institutionally determined, more individually chosen. History will barely remember their names, will subsume their sacrifice into the larger legend of the 300 Spartans. But in this moment, refusing to withdraw when given the chance, they demonstrate a kind of solidarity that transcends calculation, a commitment to the men they have fought beside that overrides rational self-interest. For those ordered to withdraw, there is a complex mixture of relief and guilt. They will live, will see their homes again, will have the chance to fight in future battles. But they will also carry the knowledge that they left comrades behind, that other men died to purchase their escape. Some will feel this as betrayal, others as simple military necessity, still others as a burden they can never fully discharge. The psychology of survival when others die is never simple or clean. As dawn breaks and the withdrawal begins, the pass transforms from a defensive position into a staging area for 2 separate operations. The main Greek force files south along the coastal route, moving as quickly as exhaustion and order permit, glancing back occasionally at the men who remain. The rearguard prepares for what comes next, checking armour one more time, redistributing remaining supplies, forming the phalanx in the narrowest section of the pass. There are no long speeches, no dramatic declarations. The situation is clear. Everyone understands their role. Words would add nothing to what is already known. Leonidas, standing among his men, carries the burden of the choice he's made. He has sent thousands home and kept hundreds here to die. He has valued the coalition above individual lives, strategy above sentiment. Whether this makes him a hero or simply a commander doing what commanders must do remains a question that each observer must answer for themselves. For now, he prepares to fight one more time, not for victory but for hours, not for glory, but for the practical value of delay in a long war. The sun climbs toward its zenith, and the final engagement begins. You stand once more in the phalanx, but the formation is smaller now, contracted around the elite core of Spartans and the loyal Thespians who refuse to leave, perhaps 1,000 men where once there were 7,000. The shields still overlap, the spears still project forward, the basic mechanics of the system remain unchanged, but you feel the difference in every way that matters. There are fewer ranks behind you, less depth to absorb casualties, less weight to push forward. The edges of the formation are more vulnerable, the flanks less secure. You are still a phalanx, still a wall of bronze and discipline, but you are a smaller wall now, and the tide pressing against you has not diminished. The Persian attacks come with renewed intensity. Xerxes knows the Greek position is compromised, knows that reinforcements approaching from the mountain path will soon complete the encirclement. But he also knows that every hour the rearguard holds is an hour the main Greek force uses to escape southward. The strategic imperative for the Persians is to break through quickly, to shatter this stubborn remnant and begin the pursuit before the withdrawing Greeks gain too much distance. So the attacks continue, wave after wave of infantry throwing themselves against the Greek line, the narrow pass once again becoming a compression chamber where numbers mean less than position and discipline. You fight with a kind of exhausted automation, your body executing movements drilled into muscle memory, while your mind drifts into something approaching detachment. The spear thrusts forward, withdraws, thrust again. The shield remains locked with those beside you. Your feet maintain their position on ground grown slippery with blood and worse. The sun tracks slowly across the sky, marking time in the most ancient way, its light shifting from morning brightness to the harsher glare of midday to the softer tones of afternoon. You are thirsty beyond measure, your throat raw with dust and exertion. Your arms ache from holding shield and spear. Small wounds you barely remember receiving throb with dull insistence. But the line holds because everyone in it continues to do what they have been trained to do, what they have chosen to do, what their presence here commits them to doing. As afternoon wears toward evening, You begin to notice changes in the pattern of combat. The Persian forces in front seem to be probing rather than pressing with full commitment. They test the Greek line, withdraw, test again. This could mean many things, but the most likely explanation arrives as a terrible certainty in your gut. The flanking force has completed its descent from the mountain. The encirclement is closing. The Persians attacking from the north no longer need to break through by frontal assault. They need only to hold your attention while forces from the south move into position. The trap is complete, or nearly so. The knowledge changes nothing practical. You have nowhere to go, no escape route that remains open, no possibility of retreat. The choice was made this morning when Leonidas divided the force, when most withdrew and you stayed. That choice locked in place a sequence of events that can only end one way. Yet knowing this intellectually and feeling it settle into your bones are different things. There is a finality that descends now, a recognition that these are truly the last hours, that the sun currently painting the western sky in shades of amber, and rose may be the last sunset you witness. Some men pray audibly, calling on gods for courage, or for quick death, or for protection of families back home. Others remain silent, turned inward, making whatever peace they can with what approaches. You notice Leonidas moving through the formation, speaking briefly to men as he passes. His presence a kind of benediction, or simply a reminder that you do not face this alone, that your king stands beside you in these final moments rather than commanding from safety. The gesture is not empty. Leadership in this culture means physical presence, means sharing the risks and the fate of those you lead. Whatever criticisms might be made of Spartan society, its commitment to this principle is absolute. The fighting intensifies as the sun descends further. You can hear sounds from the south now behind your position, confirming what you already knew. Persian forces are approaching from both directions. The phalanx, designed to face one direction, must now somehow defend against pressure from two. The formation adjusts, contracts further, forms something approaching a circle or square, every man on the perimeter now part of the fighting line. The shields face outward in all directions. The spears point toward whatever enemy approaches. The system that worked so effectively in the narrow pass begins to show its fundamental limitations. A phalanx surrounded cannot push forward. It can only contract, can only diminish, can only endure until it can endure no more. You lose track of individual moments. The combat becomes continuous, punctuated only by brief pauses when the Persians pull back to regroup. Spears break and you draw your sword, the short riposte that serves for close work. The press of bodies becomes almost intimate, the fighting reduced to the distance of an arm's length, faces visible in the fading light, close enough to see expressions of fear and determination that mirror your own. The Persian soldiers you face are not monsters. They are men doing their duty, following orders, trying to survive just as you're trying to hold position. The recognition brings neither comfort nor change. The mechanics of violence continue regardless of mutual recognition of shared humanity. As dusk approaches, the formation has shrunk to perhaps a few hundred men standing on a small hillock, or rise within the pass, surrounded on all sides, shields facing outward, the last organized resistance in a battle already lost. You can no longer see Leonidas, but you know he is still here, still standing, still fighting. Around you, the Spartans and Thespians maintain their discipline even now, even as exhaustion and wounds accumulate, even as the inevitability becomes undeniable. The phalanx has dissolved into something more primitive, a tight cluster of desperate men selling their lives as expensively as possible, buying minutes and hours with blood. The light continues to fade. Bronze and steel catch the last rays of sun, flashing briefly before being swallowed by gathering darkness. Your world narrows to the immediate, to the next breath, the next sword thrust, the next moment of continued existence. There is no glory here, no heroic speeches, no dramatic final gestures. Only the grinding work of staying alive one more minute, of holding ground one more moment, of refusing to break even when breaking would be understandable and human, and perhaps even merciful. You hold because the men beside you hold. You fight because they fight. You stand because standing is what remains when all other options have been exhausted. The end, when it comes, is not dramatic in the way later retellings will make it seem. There is no single climactic moment, no last heroic charge, no theatrical final stand that freezes time and allows for meaningful last words. The end is instead a gradual erosion, a wearing down of human capacity, a point at which the physical and psychological resources required to maintain cohesion simply run out. Spears break from repeated use, from striking bronze and bone and shield until the wood splinters or the point bends beyond usefulness. Swords dull from extended employment, their edges nicked and blunted. Shields crack under accumulated impacts, their bronze facing dented, their wooden cores compromised, their weight becoming burden rather than protection. More critically, the men holding these weapons exhaust themselves beyond the point where training and discipline can compensate. You have been fighting for hours, first through the long day, now into evening. Your muscles have moved through fatigue into something approaching paralysis. Your arms barely respond to commands. Your legs tremble under the weight of armor that seemed manageable this morning but now feels impossibly heavy. Dehydration clouds your thinking. Small wounds that seemed negligible hours ago have bled steadily, sapping strength in increments too small to notice individually but catastrophic in their cumulative effect. You're still standing, still making the motions of defense, but the effectiveness has degraded to the point where will alone cannot bridge the gap between what needs to be done and what your body can accomplish. Around you, other men reach similar limits. The formation, already contracted to its minimum viable size, begins to show gaps. A man falls and there is no one to step forward and fill his place. The shield wall develops openings that Persian soldiers exploit immediately. Once the integrity of the overlapping shields breaks down, the phalanx ceases to function as a system. Individual hoplites, however skilled or brave, cannot stand alone against multiple attackers. The protection came from mutual support, from the shields overlapping, from the depth of ranks behind pushing forward. Remove those structural elements and what remains are simply isolated men in heavy armor, exhausted and outnumbered, fighting individual battles they cannot win. The Persians, sensing the collapse, press harder. They no longer need to be cautious, no longer need to respect the defensive formation that held them at bay for days. They can close from all directions now, surrounding individual Greeks or small groups, overwhelming them through sheer numbers. Some Greeks continue to fight, swinging swords mechanically even as they are cut down from multiple directions. Others, too exhausted to continue, simply stop, lowering their weapons, accepting what comes next. A few, perhaps some of the Thebans whose commitment was always questionable, surrender, throwing down their weapons and hoping for mercy or at least survival as prisoners. The historical sources will record their surrender with scorn, but in the moment, the choice to live rather than die is comprehensible, human, deserving of neither celebration nor excessive condemnation. You do not see Leonidas fall. In the chaos and fading light, in the compression of the final melee, the Spartan king becomes simply another armoured figure fighting, and then not fighting, standing and then not standing. The sources will later claim his body became a prize fought over by both sides. That retrieval of his corpse sparked its own battle. Perhaps this is true, or perhaps he simply died like the others, like the Spartans around him, like the Thespians who stood beside them, falling in the press of combat. His death no more or less significant in its immediate physical reality than that of any other man bleeding out on the stones of Thermopylae. The darkness deepens. The final Greek resistance dissolves not in a single moment, but across a span of time, individuals and small groups falling or surrendering until there is nothing left to resist. The sounds of combat fade, replaced by the groans of the wounded, the harsh breathing of exhausted soldiers on both sides, the strange quiet that follows intense violence. Persian troops move through the contested ground, finishing wounded enemies, gathering weapons and armor, beginning the grim accounting that follows battle. The pass, held so effectively for 3 days, finally falls completely into Persian control. The Greek dead lie where they fell, scattered across the narrow corridor, particularly concentrated in the area where the final stand occurred. Their armor catches what little light remains, bronze dull under coating of dust and blood. Their faces, for those whose helmets have been removed or dislodged, show the blank expression of the dead, all individual personality erased by death's levelling. They are no longer Spartans or Thespians or Thebans, no longer individuals with names and histories and families waiting back home. They are simply casualties, bodies to be counted and disposed of, evidence of a battle fought and a position that changed hands. Among the Persian forces there is relief mixed with respect. The Greeks made them pay heavily for the pass. Persian casualties over the 3 days of fighting number in the thousands, exact figures impossible to determine but the cost undeniable. Soldiers who fought against the phalanx directly understand what it cost to break it, understand that the Greeks were not defeated by superior Persian tactics or overwhelming valour, but by geography's betrayal, by the mountain path that negated the defensive advantage, by the simple reality that even the best position becomes untenable when flanked. There is no shame in the Greek defeat and no particular glory in the Persian victory. A battle was fought under specific conditions. Those conditions changed. The outcome followed inevitably from the changed circumstances. The silence that settles over Thermopylae as full darkness arrives is profound. The sea continues its patient work against the shore. The mountains stand unchanged. The hot springs bubble quietly in their crevices. The past simply exists, as it has always existed, now littered with the debris of human conflict, but fundamentally unaltered by what has transpired. In a few days or weeks, efforts will be made to clear the dead, to give some decent treatment to Greek bodies if possible, to restore the route for the Persian army's continued advance. In a few years, the physical evidence of the battle will fade, the blood washed away by rain, the disturbed earth settling back into place. In a few centuries, the exact location of the fighting will become uncertain, the coastline shifting with time, the details blurring into legend. But for now, in this immediate aftermath, the reality is simple and stark. Men came to this place to fight. Many of them died here. The past changed hands. The Persian advance continues. The Greek withdrawal proceeds. The war moves on to its next phase, carrying with it both the strategic consequences of what happened here and the beginning of a legend that will grow far beyond the actual events. The 3 days at Thermopylae end not with thunder, but with exhausted silence, not with grand gestures, but with the plain fact of bodies cooling in the night air, of a defensive position finally overwhelmed, of human limits reached and exceeded and finally broken. The hot gates stand quiet under the emerging stars, witnesses to what has passed, patient in their indifference to human wars. The stones remember nothing. The sea acknowledges nothing. Only the survivors, Greek and Persian alike, will carry forward the memory of what happened here, and that memory will be shaped by needs and purposes far beyond the simple reality of 3 days fighting in a narrow coastal pass. The Persian army moves south along the coastal route, no longer constrained by the narrow pass, no longer forced to funnel through a geographic choke point where Greek discipline could neutralize their numerical advantage. The pass is theirs now. The way lies open. The thousands upon thousands of soldiers who waited impatiently behind the fighting can finally advance, finally move toward the objectives that brought them across the Hellespont and through Thrace and Macedonia. The army spreads out as it marches, occupying the full width of available terrain, a vast organism flowing across the landscape like water released from a broken dam. The Greek forces that withdrew from Thermopylae before the final collapse move ahead of this advance, maintaining what order they can, retreating toward defensive positions further south. They carry with them the knowledge of what happened at the pass, the news that Leonidas and the rearguard fell, that the position could not be held indefinitely, that the Persian host is coming, and nothing now stands between it and the heartland of Greece. The mood among the retreating soldiers is complex, a mixture of relief at their own survival, grief for the men who died to enable their escape, and deep uncertainty about what comes next. The strategic plan that seemed so reasonable, the idea of holding Thermopylae while preparing deeper defences, has only partially succeeded. Yes, the retreat was covered. Yes, most of the Greek force survived. But the Persians are advancing, and the psychological impact of losing the pass, of abandoning that symbolic line, weighs heavily. Cities throughout central Greece receive the news with mounting alarm. Phocis and Boeotia, regions in the direct path of the Persian advance, must make immediate choices about resistance or submission. Some communities, seeing the size of the approaching force and calculating the cost of defiance, choose accommodation. They send delegations to meet the Persians, offering submission, providing supplies, hoping that cooperation will protect them from destruction. These choices are not made lightly. Each represents a weighing of terrible alternatives, a calculation about survival in circumstances where honourable options are scarce. Other communities, Whether from conviction or from geographic position or from simple inertia, wait to see what develops, preparing for siege or evacuation but not yet committing to either resistance or surrender. Athens, the largest and most exposed city in the alliance, faces an existential decision. The city lies on the coast, easily approached by the Persian fleet, vulnerable to both naval and land assault. The Athenian assembly debates frantically. Some argue for defending the city walls, for trusting in the fortifications and fighting house by house if necessary. Others advocate for evacuation, for abandoning the physical city to save the population, for relying on the Athenian fleet rather than fixed defences. The oracles are consulted, their ambiguous pronouncements interpreted and reinterpreted to support various courses of action. The decision that eventually emerges is radical and wrenching. The city will be evacuated. The population, or as much of it as can be moved, will be relocated to nearby islands and to Troezen across the Saronic Gulf. The fleet will become the true Athens, carrying the city's future in its ships rather than in its stone buildings. This decision to abandon Athens represents both desperation and strategic sophistication. It acknowledges that fixed positions can be bypassed or besieged into submission, that cities are made of people rather than buildings, that survival matters more than symbolic resistance. But it also requires abandoning homes, temples, entire lifetimes of accumulated possessions and memories. Families must decide what can be carried and what must be left behind. The elderly and infirm must be moved despite the difficulty and danger. Livestock, furniture, family shrines, all the material infrastructure of daily life must be left for the Persians to loot or burn. The emotional cost of this evacuation is staggering, though historical sources focus more on strategic outcomes than on individual grief. As the Persian army advances deeper into Greece, cities burn, whether through deliberate Persian policy, through the chaos of military occupation, through the actions of Greek collaborators settling old scores, or simply through the breakdown of order that accompanies invasion. Fires consume structures that have stood for generations. Temples are violated, treasuries plundered, sacred sites treated with the casual disrespect of conquerors who do not share the victims' religious devotion. These destructions are not always systematic or ideologically motivated. War creates conditions where destruction happens almost automatically, where the normal restraints of civilized society dissolve, where soldiers far from home and uncertain of their own survival take what they want because they can. The Greek alliance, so fragile even in the best circumstances, strains under the pressure of defeat and retreat. Cities that contributed contingents to Thermopylae now question whether continued resistance serves their interests. Some begin negotiating privately with Persian representatives, seeking terms, trying to secure favourable treatment by switching sides before the situation deteriorates further. Others remain committed to resistance but disagree vehemently about strategy and leadership. Athens and Sparta, the two pillars of the coalition, must somehow maintain unity of purpose while dealing with their own city's immediate crises, and with the centrifugal forces pulling the alliance apart. Yet the coalition does not completely collapse. Despite the defeats, despite the retreat, despite the smoke rising from burning cities, enough Greek polis remain committed to resistance that the war continues. The strategic situation is dire but not hopeless. The Greek fleet remains intact, having fought the Persian navy to a rough draw at Artemisium during the same days that Thermopylae was being contested. That fleet represents a capability the Persians must respect, a force that can threaten their supply lines, attack coastal positions, and potentially isolate their army from naval support. The Greeks who evacuated Athens have not surrendered. They have repositioned. They have traded the indefensible for the potentially defensible, buildings for mobility, fixed positions for strategic flexibility. The psychological impact of the Persian advance, the visible evidence of their power, the sheer overwhelming presence of their army spreading across the Greek landscape, all of this creates a kind of collective trauma among the Greeks who witness it. But trauma does not always produce collapse. Sometimes it produces a desperate clarity, a recognition that retreat is no longer an option, that everything is genuinely at stake, that the next battle will determine not just tactics but survival. The Greeks falling back before the Persian advance are not defeated in spirit, merely defeated in position. They seek ground where they can stand again, where geography might again favour disciplined defenders over numerous attackers, where the war can continue and perhaps turn in a different direction. The darkness descending over Greece as the Persians advance is literal and metaphorical. Literal in the smoke from burning buildings, in the autumn approaching with its shorter days, in the gloom of defeat and uncertainty. Metaphorical in the sense that the future has become opaque, that outcomes which seemed possible now seem remote, that the confident plans made before Thermopylae must be revised or abandoned. But darkness is not the same as ending. The war continues. The alliance, battered and diminished but not destroyed, continues. The determination to resist, however it may be questioned or complicated by individual cities' calculations, continues to exist among enough Greeks that the Persian conquest of Greece remains incomplete, contested, uncertain in its ultimate resolution. The story of Thermopylae does not end with the fall of the pass, does not conclude with Persian triumph and Greek defeat. That engagement was never meant to decide the war by itself, was never designed as a final stand but rather as one move in a longer strategic sequence. The Greeks who died at the Hot Gates bought time, delayed the Persian advance, demonstrated that resistance was possible even against overwhelming numbers, but the real question, the question that matters for the survival of Greek independence, is what happens next. Can the fragile coalition hold together long enough to find ground more favourable for defence? Can Greek unity, so provisional and contested, survive the pressure of continued retreat and mounting losses? Can strategic adaptation overcome tactical defeat? The answer begins to take shape in the waters of the Saronic Gulf, in the narrow straits between the mainland and the island of Salamis. The Greek fleet, having withdrawn from Artemisium after fighting the Persian navy to a stalemate during the same days that Thermopylae was being contested, regroups in these confined waters. The Athenian contingent forms the core of this fleet, several hundred triremes, the sleek warships designed for ramming and close manoeuvring. Around the Athenian ships cluster the naval contributions from other Greek cities, each adding their strength to a combined fleet that numbers perhaps 380 vessels, substantial but still outnumbered by the Persian armada. The strategic logic that governed the choice of Thermopylae applies again here, translated from land to sea. The Greeks cannot match Persian numbers in open water any more than they could match Persian infantry on open plains. But in the narrow straits of Salamis, where the Persian fleet cannot deploy its full strength simultaneously, where manoeuvrability matters more than sheer quantity of ships, the Greeks find conditions that favour their heavier, more tactically sophisticated vessels. The Persian commanders, perhaps overconfident after the fall of Thermopylae, perhaps pressed by Xerxes to achieve quick victory, perhaps simply miscalculating the tactical implications of confined waters, commit their fleet to battle in these straits. The resulting engagement, fought in late September of 480, becomes the turning point that Thermopylae was not. The Greek triremes, handling better in confined space, coordinating through practice manoeuvres, ram and disable Persian ships faster than the Persians, can bring reinforcements into the narrow fighting area. The Persian advantage of numbers becomes a liability as ships crowd together, collide with each other, lose the freedom to manoeuvre. By day's end, the Persian fleet has suffered catastrophic losses, perhaps 200 ships sunk or disabled, their naval superiority destroyed in a single day's fighting. Xerxes, watching from a throne positioned on shore to observe what he expected would be a triumphant victory, instead witnesses disaster. The naval defeat transforms the strategic calculus completely. The Persian army, enormous and seemingly unstoppable, depends on a supply line stretching back through hostile or uncertain territory. That supply line requires naval support, requires the ability to move provisions by sea along the coast, requires control of waters that the Persians can no longer guarantee. Xerxes, facing the onset of winter, confronting the prospect of feeding his massive army in a devastated Greece with contested supply routes, makes the decision to withdraw the bulk of his forces back to Asia. He leaves behind a substantial occupation force, perhaps 50,000 men under the command of Mardonius, but the great invasion has lost its momentum. The irresistible tide has been checked. The following summer, in 479, the remaining Persian force faces the assembled Greek army at Plataea in Boeotia. The Greeks, their confidence restored by Salamis, their alliance strengthened by survival and success, field an army of perhaps 40,000 hoplites, the largest unified Greek force yet assembled. The Spartans contribute their full strength, Not just a small elite contingent, but thousands of Spartan citizens and additional thousands of their subject peoples. The Athenians send their hoplites, returned from the islands where they sheltered after evacuating their city. Contingents from dozens of Greek polis join the force, each bringing the disciplined heavy infantry that proved effective at Thermopylae, but now deployed in numbers sufficient to match the enemy. At Plataea, the phalanx finds terrain that allows it to function at full effectiveness, without being outflanked or bypassed. The battle is hard fought, the outcome uncertain through much of the day, but when the Greek line finally pushes through the Persian infantry, the result is decisive. Mardonius falls in the fighting, his army breaks and flees. The Persian occupation of Greece collapses. The invasion that began with such overwhelming force, that seemed capable of crushing Greek resistance through sheer mass and imperial resources, ends in retreat and defeat. The twin victories at Salamis and Plataea do not erase the trauma of the invasion, do not restore the burned temples or rebuild the destroyed cities. Athens returns to find its Acropolis sacked, its homes looted, its sacred spaces violated. Other cities suffer similar damage. The cost of resistance has been enormous in material terms, staggering in human casualties, wrenching in psychological impact. But Greek independence survives. The Poleis remained free to govern themselves, to maintain their various experiments in democracy and oligarchy and kingship, to continue their quarrelsome, creative, fractious existence. The Persian Empire, checked in its westward expansion, turns its attention to other frontiers and internal matters. In retrospect, Thermopylae takes its place as a necessary but not sufficient element of Greek survival. The stand at the pass delayed the Persian advance, preserved the coalition long enough for naval forces to regroup, demonstrated that disciplined infantry in favourable terrain could resist overwhelming numbers. The sacrifice of the rearguard bought time that proved invaluable. Leonidas and the Spartans and Thespians who died with him served a strategic purpose, even if that purpose became clear only in the months that followed. Their deaths were not meaningless gestures but practical contributions to a war that required both tactical defeats and strategic victories. The broader lesson, perhaps, is about adaptability and resilience. The Greek coalition, faced with defeat at Thermopylae, did not collapse. It adjusted. It found new ground, new strategies, new ways to leverage its particular advantages against Persian weaknesses. The Athenian decision to abandon their city and trust in their fleet, radical and painful as it was, proved strategically sound. The Spartan commitment to send their full army to Plataea, overcoming their traditional reluctance to campaign far from home, demonstrated that even rigid military cultures can adapt when circumstances demand it. Greek victory came not from superior virtue or divine favour, but from flexibility, from the ability to learn from defeats, from the persistence to continue fighting despite losses and setbacks. These are human qualities, admirable but not supernatural, accessible to any people willing to pay the price of sustained effort and sacrifice. The story of Thermopylae begins its transformation from history into myth almost immediately, starting with the very first attempts to record what happened. Our primary ancient source is Herodotus, the Greek historian who wrote his accounts perhaps 40 or 50 years after the battle, drawing on oral traditions, eyewitness testimony from survivors and participants, and the collective memory of Greek cities that experienced the invasion. Herodotus is invaluable, the closest thing we have to a contemporary account, but he is also a storyteller as much as a historian in the modern sense. He shapes his narrative for dramatic effect, for moral instruction, for the entertainment and edification of his audience. He includes details that may or may not be factual, conversations that surely cannot be accurately remembered decades later, motivations that are inferred or imagined rather than documented. Most significantly, Herodotus gives us numbers that strain credulity. He claims the Persian army numbered over 5 million men, that the fleet contained 1,200 warships, that the sheer mass of the invasion force drank rivers dry and consumed the resources of entire regions in days. These numbers are impossible, not merely exaggerated, but logistically incoherent. No ancient state, however wealthy or organized, could field, supply, and move 5 million soldiers across difficult terrain. The infrastructure does not exist. The agricultural surplus to feed such numbers for the duration of a campaign cannot be mobilized. The organizational complexity exceeds what pre-industrial administration can manage. Modern scholars, working backward from what we know about ancient logistics, about food requirements, about marching rates and supply chains, estimate the actual Persian force at somewhere between 120,000 and 300,000 soldiers, still massive by ancient standards but an order of magnitude smaller than Herodotus claims. Why does Herodotus exaggerate? Partly perhaps he is simply passing along the inflated estimates that circulated among Greeks, who saw the Persian host and tried to count it, who arrived at numbers that reflected their terror and awe rather than accurate census. Partly he may be engaging in conscious dramatization, understanding that larger numbers make the Greek achievement seem more impressive, that defeating 5 million enemies is a better story than defeating 200,000. Partly he may be working within a cultural tradition that uses large numbers symbolically, where millions means a terrifying amount rather than a precise count. Whatever the mix of motivations, the effect is to create a narrative where Greek courage confronts almost supernatural odds, where the 300 become not merely outnumbered, but impossibly outnumbered, where the defence of Thermopylae transforms from a clever use of terrain and discipline into something approaching miraculous. The number 300 itself, while more accurate than the Persian millions, becomes symbolic in ways that obscure the fuller reality. Yes, 300 Spartans stood at Thermopylae, but they stood alongside 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, 1,000 Phocians, and contingents from multiple other cities, a force of roughly 7,000 total. The sources acknowledge this, but the cultural memory compresses the story, focusing attention on the Spartan elite, allowing the other contributors to fade into historical obscurity. This is partly because Spartan military reputation makes them more dramatically interesting, partly because the tight number 300 is more memorable than the messy reality of a multi-city coalition, with shifting numbers and ambiguous loyalties. The compression serves narrative clarity at the cost of historical completeness. As generations pass and the story is retold in speeches, poetry, public commemorations, and later historical accounts, the mythologization intensifies. The strategic purpose of the stand, the calculated decision to hold a choke point while building deeper defenses, gradually recedes. What emerges instead is a story of pure heroic courage, of men who chose death over dishonor, who stood against impossible odds because virtue demanded it. The practical military calculations, the role of geography, the fact that the position was designed to be temporary, all of this complexity simplifies into a cleaner narrative of sacrifice and glory. The legend serves the purposes of Greek civic identity, provides an example for citizens to emulate, reinforces the values that Greek cities want to cultivate in their populations. This process of mythologization is not unique to Thermopylae. All cultures transform their histories into myths that serve present needs, that teach desired lessons, that create usable paths for contemporary purposes. The remarkable thing about Thermopylae is not that it was mythologized, but that we can still partially recover the historical reality beneath the myth. The sources, despite their exaggerations and dramatizations, preserve enough factual detail that modern scholarship can reconstruct a more nuanced account. We can estimate more realistic numbers. We can understand the strategic context. We can restore visibility to the forgotten allies. We can appreciate the role of terrain and tactics rather than supernatural courage. Does this demythologizing diminish the story? It might seem so at first glance. A defense against 200,000 is less impressive than a defense against 5 million. Acknowledging that the Spartans had thousands of allies is less dramatically pure than imagining them standing alone. Recognizing that the stand was a calculated delaying action is less romantically satisfying than believing it was a choice of death over dishonor for its own sake. But actually, the more nuanced version is richer, more interesting, more applicable to real human experience. The achievement of holding a narrow pass through clever use of terrain and disciplined infantry tactics is genuinely impressive without requiring mythical exaggeration. The choice to sacrifice a rearguard to save the main force is genuinely difficult and meaningful, without needing to be framed as seeking glorious death. The cooperation of multiple Greek cities, despite their mutual distrust and fragile unity, is genuinely remarkable, without requiring Spartan heroes to stand alone. The myth serves one set of purposes, providing inspiration and cultural identity and memorable narrative. The history serves another set of purposes, providing understanding of how ancient warfare actually worked, how fragile coalitions can achieve temporary unity, how strategic defeats can contribute to ultimate victory. both have value. Both can coexist. We can appreciate the myth for what it accomplishes culturally, while also pursuing the history for what it teaches us about human societies under stress, about military systems and their limitations, about the complex relationship between individual courage and collective strategy. The Hot Gates hold both the legend and the reality, neither cancelling the other, each offering its own kind of truth about what humans can endure and achieve when circumstances demand it. When you stand at Thermopylae today, if you can locate the approximate site where the ancient pass once existed, before centuries of sediment deposition shifted the coastline and changed the geography, you find monuments and inscriptions commemorating the battle. The most famous is the epitaph attributed to the poet Simonides, carved in stone, addressing those who pass by with words meant to echo through time. It speaks of Spartans, of duty fulfilled, of men who kept their sworn word. It is beautiful, moving, economical in its language and profound in its implications, but it speaks primarily of Spartans. It memorializes the 300. It says little or nothing about the others who died there, the 700 Thespians who refused to withdraw, the Phocians and Locrians who contributed contingents, the soldiers from smaller cities whose names were never recorded in monuments or poems. This erasure is not malicious, but it is thorough. History, especially ancient history, privileges the memorable over the comprehensive. Sparta had a reputation, a mystique, a cultural weight that made stories about Spartans more interesting to ancient audiences. The 300 were professional soldiers from a city synonymous with military excellence. Their stand confirmed what everyone already believed about Spartan courage and discipline. The story fit existing narratives, reinforced cultural assumptions, provided a satisfying symbolic resonance. So the 300 became the story, and the others gradually faded from collective memory, their contributions acknowledged in passing if at all, their individual names lost to time. Yet the historical sources, fragmentary and incomplete as they are, preserve enough evidence to reconstruct at least the outline of who else stood at Thermopylae. We know about the Thespians, that 700 of them remained with Leonidas when most of the Greek force withdrew. We know their city was small, that contributing 700 men represented a massive commitment proportionally, that their entire adult male citizen population was probably only a few thousand. We know that after the battle, when the Persian army moved south, Thespia was destroyed, its population enslaved or scattered, punishment for their defiance. The Thespians at Thermopylae died knowing this fate awaited their city, died understanding that their choice to stand meant not just their own deaths, but likely the destruction of everything they sought to protect. Their sacrifice was comprehensive, total, extending beyond individual mortality to encompass civic annihilation. The Thebans present a more complicated case. Ancient sources report that 400 Thebans were part of the final stand, but also that many of them surrendered rather than fight to the death, choosing captivity over martyrdom. Later, Greek writers treat this surrender with contempt, viewing it as cowardice or betrayal. But the reality was likely more nuanced. Thebes was a city divided in its loyalties, containing factions that favoured resistance to Persia and factions that counselled accommodation. The Thebans at Thermopylae may have been there partly as hostages, their presence ensuring their city's cooperation, their fate uncertain from the start. When the position became untenable, when death appeared certain and meaningless, some chose to surrender. This choice can be judged harshly or sympathetically depending on one's values and assumptions, but it represents a genuine human dilemma, a moment when the clarity of duty dissolved into the ambiguity of survival instinct. Beyond these larger contingents, we have only fragmentary knowledge of other contributions. We know that Phocians and Locrians were present, that various small cities sent their men, that the total Greek force before the withdrawal numbered around 7,000. But we do not know most of their names. We do not know their stories, their motivations, their final moments. They marched to Thermopylae. They stood in the phalanx. They fought against the Persian attacks, and then they either died or withdrew. And history recorded only the bare fact of their presence, not the texture of their experience or the particularity of their individual lives. This anonymity is the common fate of most people in most historical events. We remember leaders because leadership is documented, because commanders write reports and make decisions that get recorded. We remember elite units like the Spartans because their distinctiveness makes them memorable, because their culture produces the kind of stories that survive. But the ordinary soldier, the farmer citizen who takes up his armour and marches to war because his city requires it, who fights competently but not distinctively, who dies in the press of combat without performing any act that draws special attention, this person vanishes from history almost immediately. His name might appear on a casualty list if such lists were kept and survived, but more likely even that small memorial is lost. His family remembers him, his city counts him among its dead, but the wider world moves on without recording his sacrifice. Yet it is precisely these anonymous soldiers who make events like Thermopylae possible. The 300 Spartans could not have held the pass alone. They needed the mass of allied troops to provide the depth and width necessary to maintain a defensive formation. They needed the Thespians beside them to anchor the line. They needed the thousands who withdrew to have made the initial stand that delayed the Persians for 2 days before the position was compromised. The famous few depend absolutely on the forgotten many, even though historical memory inverts this relationship, treating the many as background for the few. When we try to imagine what happened at Thermopylae, when we reconstruct the 3 days of fighting and the final stand, we should populate that imagined scene not just with 300 crimson-cloaked Spartans, but with the full diversity of Greeks who were actually there. Men from Thespiae who spoke with a different accent, who worshipped the same gods but in slightly different ways, who had their own civic traditions and local heroes. Men from smaller towns whose names we barely recognise today, whose contribution to Greek culture is minimal in the grand narrative, but who in that moment stood in the line and faced the enemy with whatever courage or fear or resignation they could muster. Men who were not professional soldiers, who had farms to tend and families to support, who came to Thermopylae because their city asked it of them, because the alternative seemed worse, because sometimes people rise to occasions even when rising seems impossible. The Hot Gates remember them all equally, which is to say the Hot Gates remember none of them. The stones are indifferent. The sea continues its work regardless of human drama. But we, inheritors of the historical memory that was shaped by that battle, can choose to resist the simplification, can insist on complexity, can honour the anonymous alongside the famous. The story is richer for it, more true to the actual texture of ancient warfare, more honest about who pays the cost when political decisions lead to military conflict. The battle at Thermopylae ends in 480 before the Common Era, but the memory of those 3 days continues for millennia, evolving and adapting to serve the needs of successive generations. The story becomes a touchstone in Western culture, invoked by orators and politicians, taught to school children, referenced in literature and art, transformed into a symbol that carries meanings far beyond the tactical details of ancient Greek warfare. Each era finds something different in the story, shapes it to reflect contemporary concerns, uses it to argue for values that the original participants might not have recognized or endorsed. In ancient Greece itself, Thermopylae quickly becomes part of civic memory and political rhetoric. Sparta uses the story to reinforce its identity as the preeminent military power, to justify its rigid social system, to argue that Spartan discipline and training produce soldiers who can accomplish what others cannot. The 300 become exemplars of Spartan virtues, their deaths proof that the harsh upbringing and constant military focus produce men capable of superhuman endurance. Other Greek cities, while honouring the sacrifice, also use the story more subtly to critique Spartan culture, to suggest that such rigid militarism may produce effective soldiers, but at tremendous human cost, that perhaps societies need not be so single-mindedly focused on warfare to produce brave and capable defenders. In the Hellenistic period and later under Roman rule, as Greece loses its political independence and becomes absorbed into larger empires, Thermopylae takes on additional resonance. It becomes a story about Greek identity itself, about what it meant to be Greek in an earlier, freer age, about resistance to foreign domination. The fact that the resistance ultimately succeeded, that Greek independence survived the Persian threat, lends the story a kind of redemptive quality. The sacrifice was not in vain. The stand mattered. Freedom was preserved, at least for a time, through the willingness of men to defend narrow passes against overwhelming odds. As Western civilization evolves through the medieval period, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, each era discovers new meanings in the ancient story. Medieval writers, working within a feudal culture that values knightly honour and service to lords, see in Thermopylae an example of perfect loyalty, of vassals faithful unto death to their king. Renaissance humanists, rediscovering classical texts and celebrating ancient Greek culture, hold up the 300 as exemplars of classical virtue, of the kind of civic courage that modern societies should aspire to recreate. Enlightenment thinkers, arguing for rational governance and criticizing tyranny, find in the Greek resistance to Persian despotism a validation of republican values over imperial absolutism. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as nationalism becomes a dominant political force, Thermopylae is repeatedly invoked to inspire resistance to invasion or oppression. Various nations claim the story as somehow belonging to their particular national character, as proof that small determined peoples can resist larger aggressors. The details of the ancient battle matter less than the symbolic message, that courage and unity can overcome numerical disadvantage, that defending homeland justifies sacrifice, that some causes warrant dying for. These invocations are not always historically sophisticated or morally unproblematic. The story gets used to justify wars that have little in common with the ancient Greek-Persian conflict, gets deployed in service of ideologies that would be foreign to Leonidas and his contemporaries. What makes Thermopylae so adaptable, so useful across such different contexts, is partly the story's basic structure. A small force defending homeland against foreign invasion, fighting bravely against impossible odds, sacrificing themselves to buy time for their community to survive. This is a narrative template that can be mapped onto many situations, that speaks to fundamental human concerns about defense of home, about loyalty to community, about the meaning of sacrifice. The specific details, the actual historical context, can be adjusted or simplified to fit contemporary needs, while the essential emotional and symbolic core remains recognizable. The modern cinematic versions, the comic book adaptations, the video games and popular culture references continue this process of adaptation and simplification. They take the bare bones of the story, emphasize action and heroism, strip away historical complexity in favor of dramatic clarity. 300 warriors in slow-motion combat against endless Persian hordes makes for compelling visual spectacle, even if it bears only passing resemblance to the actual mechanics of ancient phalanx warfare. These modern retellings serve their own purposes, providing entertainment, exploring themes of masculinity and sacrifice, creating mythic narratives for contemporary audiences. They are not history in any rigorous sense, but they keep the story alive, ensure that Thermopylae remains part of cultural consciousness. What do we make of this evolution from history to myth to popular culture? One response is to lament the distortion, to insist that the true story, properly understood with its complexity and nuance, matters more than the simplified legend. And there is value in that insistence, value in pushing back against easy mythologizing, in restoring historical accuracy where possible. But another response is to recognize that stories do this, that cultural memory inevitably transforms and adapts what it preserves, that the meaning of historical events is never fixed but always under negotiation by successive generations, who bring their own concerns and questions to the past. Thermopylae can be both history and symbol, both a specific 3-day engagement, in 480 and a timeless story about resistance and sacrifice. We can study the actual battle with scholarly rigour, while also acknowledging the power of the legend, can appreciate the symbolic resonance while insisting on factual accuracy, can honour both the men who actually died in that pass, and the cultural meanings that their deaths have accumulated over millennia. The two approaches need not be in conflict. They serve different purposes, answer different questions, speak to different aspects of why we care about the past at all. Walking through history is never a simple journey from past to present. It is instead a constant dialogue between what happened and what we remember, between the fragments of evidence that survive and the stories we construct from those fragments, between the dead who cannot speak for themselves and the living who must somehow give voice to their experiences and their choices. Thermopylae, like all historical events that achieve legendary status, exists in this complicated space between fact and interpretation, between the stones of the actual past and the monuments we build in memory, between the silence of the dead and the endless speaking of those who come after. The echoes continue, each generation hearing something slightly different, finding in that narrow pass between mountain and sea whatever meanings they need, whatever lessons their own times demand. The hot gates remain, patient and unchanged, while human memory dances around them, shaping and reshaping the story of 3 days in summer, when men stood and fought and died, and, in dying, became something more than themselves, became story, became memory, became us. What does Thermopylae whisper to us across the millennia? What lessons can we draw from those 3 days in a narrow coastal pass, from the choices made by men long dead, from a battle that was both a defeat and somehow more than a defeat? The answers are not simple, not reducible to easy maxims or inspirational slogans. But there is wisdom in the story if we approach it with care, if we resist the temptation to simplify what was complex, if we honour both the historical reality and the human experiences embedded within it. First, perhaps, is a lesson about the relationship between geography and power. The Persian Empire brought overwhelming force to Greece, an army that dwarfed anything the Greeks could assemble, resources that seemed limitless, organisational capacity that demonstrated the achievements of centuries of imperial development. By any straightforward calculation of power, the Persians should have swept through Greece with minimal resistance, absorbing the fractious city-states into their empire, as they had absorbed so many other peoples and territories. But power is never simply a matter of numbers or resources. It is always mediated by terrain, by logistics, by the specific circumstances of how and where force must be applied. At Thermopylae, the narrow pass transformed the calculus completely. Persian numbers became irrelevant. Their cavalry could not deploy. Their archers could not find clear fields of fire. The advantages that made them dominant in open battle dissolved in the compressed space between mountain and sea. This is not a romantic notion about the weak overcoming the strong through courage alone. It is a practical observation about the contingent nature of power, about how dominance in one context does not guarantee dominance in another. Modern societies would do well to remember this lesson. Military might, economic resources, technological superiority all convey real advantages, but none guarantee success in every circumstance. Geography still matters. Local knowledge still matters. The specifics of terrain and context can neutralize advantages that seem overwhelming in the abstract. Power is always more fragile, more dependent on particular conditions than those who possess it typically recognize. Second, there is a lesson about unity and its costs. The Greek coalition that defended Thermopylae was provisional, fragile, held together by shared fear and temporary common purpose, rather than by any deep structural bonds. The cities that contributed forces retained their sovereignty, their distinct identities, their ability to withdraw if circumstances changed or if their particular interests diverged from the collective good. This fragility was both weakness and strength. It was weakness because the coalition could fracture at any moment, because trust was limited, because strategic decisions required endless negotiation among jealous equals. But it was also strength, because the voluntary nature of the cooperation meant that those who participated did so from genuine conviction, or at least from rational calculation of self-interest. No one was compelled by some distant imperial authority. No one fought for causes they did not choose. Modern democracies and alliances face similar challenges. Unity achieved through coercion or through the suppression of legitimate differences is brittle, likely to shatter when pressure mounts. Unity based on voluntary cooperation, on negotiated common purpose despite disagreements, is harder to achieve but more resilient once established. The Greeks at Thermopylae demonstrated that fragmented, argumentative, mutually suspicious communities can cooperate when the threat is sufficiently clear and the alternative sufficiently dire. But they also demonstrated that such cooperation is never easy, never automatic, never free from tension, and the constant possibility of dissolution. These are uncomfortable truths for societies that prefer to imagine unity as natural and simple, rather than as something continuously constructed through difficult negotiation. Third, perhaps, is a reflection on sacrifice and its meanings. The men who died at Thermopylae, whether in the initial fighting or in the final rearguard action, gave their lives for a cause that transcended their individual survival. This is undeniable and deserves acknowledgement. But we should be cautious about romanticizing their deaths or treating sacrifice as an unambiguous good. The Spartan cultural system that produced the 300 was brutal, deforming, built on slavery and the systematic subordination of human development to military efficiency. The willingness to die for Sparta does not make Spartan society admirable in all its aspects. Similarly, the sacrifice of the Thespians and others, however moving, does not erase the reality that wars consume lives, that young men die for decisions made by leaders who often survive, that the costs of conflict fall unevenly and often unjustly. We can honour sacrifice without celebrating the systems that demand it. We can acknowledge courage without endorsing militarism. We can recognise that sometimes defensive stands are necessary, that sometimes people must risk everything to protect what they value, while also maintaining scepticism about whether any particular war or battle was truly unavoidable, whether all the deaths served purposes that justify their cost. Thermopylae teaches us that humans are capable of extraordinary endurance and solidarity in extremis, but it should also prompt us to ask how often we create the extremis unnecessarily. How many passes need defending because of failures of diplomacy or wisdom long before the fighting starts? Finally, there is something in the story about scale and human limits. The men who fought at Thermopylae were not superhuman. They were not blessed by gods or possessed of qualities unavailable to ordinary people. They were soldiers using a military system developed over generations, deployed in terrain that favoured their particular tactical strengths, fighting with the resources and determination available to them in that moment. They succeeded for 3 days because the circumstances aligned in their favour. They failed when those circumstances changed, when the mountain path was revealed, when the defensive advantage evaporated. There is no shame in that failure, no indication that they lacked courage or commitment. There is only the recognition that human capacity has limits, that even the best systems and the bravest soldiers cannot overcome overwhelming disadvantage indefinitely. This too speaks to modern conditions. We live in an age that often celebrates the unlimited, that encourages us to believe that will and effort can overcome any obstacle, that limits exist only to be transcended. But limits are real. Resources are finite. Human endurance has thresholds. Systems optimized for one purpose struggle when conditions change. Recognizing limits is not defeatism but realism, not weakness but wisdom. The Greeks at Thermopylae fought brilliantly within the constraints they faced, but when those constraints shifted, they adapted or fell. There is dignity in both the fighting and the falling, in the effort and in the recognition of what effort cannot accomplish alone. So perhaps what Thermopylae whispers most quietly, most persistently across the centuries is this: that human societies are always fragile, always dependent on cooperation among imperfect people, always vulnerable to changes in circumstance that can transform strength into weakness. That courage and sacrifice are real and valuable, but not sufficient by themselves to guarantee survival or success. That geography and context and the specific details of how power must be applied matter as much as the abstract possession of power. That unity is hard, costly, never complete, but sometimes sufficient to accomplish what fragments cannot. That we remember the heroic because it serves our need for meaning and inspiration, but that the anonymous and ordinary also shaped outcomes, also mattered, also deserved to be restored to visibility and honour. The past remains, patient and silent. The sea continues its ancient rhythm. The mountains stand as they have stood for millions of years, indifferent to the brief violence of 3 summer days 2,500 years ago. But we, carrying forward the memory, can find in that narrow corridor something worth contemplating as sleep approaches, as the day's urgencies fade, as we seek that calm space between waking thought and rest. The hot gates hold their lessons gently, offering them to anyone patient enough to listen, thoughtful enough to move beyond legend into the more complicated but more human territory of history. May that contemplation carry you softly into night, into quiet, into peace.